In the year 1877, a man in a museum in New Haven, Connecticut, held a handful of broken bones and imagined a creature that had never lived. The bones had come out of the rock near the little town of Morrison, Colorado, quarried in haste and shipped east in crates. They were fragmentary, incomplete, a scatter of chips and plates and one great arched piece of back. The man was Othniel Charles Marsh, and from these few pieces he pictured something strange. He saw a broad, flat animal, a swimmer, a turtle-backed thing that drifted through ancient water with bony plates lying flat across its spine like shingles laid over the ridge of a roof. He gave it a name that carried that first wrong picture inside it: Stegosaurus, roof lizard. That was the beginning of one of the longest arguments in the history of the science, and it began with a mistake. Consider the numbers Marsh could not yet see. The animal he was naming had walked the Earth roughly 155 to 150 million years ago, in the slice of deep-time paleontologists called the Kimmeridgian, near the close of the Late Jurassic. A full-grown adult stretched somewhere between 21 and 23 feet from the tip of its small beaked snout to the last spike of its tail, about the length of a modern school bus. The plates that Marsh imagined lying flat, the plates that would become the most famous silhouette in the fossil record, stood in the largest examples close to 2 feet tall, and Marsh worked out this whole first vision, this drifting armoured swimmer, from bone chips you could have closed inside a single fist. Settle in for a while. There is no hurry here, and nothing that needs to be solved tonight. Let your breathing slow and let the room go soft around you, and we will walk backward together, slowly, through many millions of years, until the light changes, and the air grows warm and heavy, and the ground underfoot belongs to a world that has been gone for longer than you can truly feel. You do not have to hold the numbers. You do not have to remember the names. Let them pass over you like weather. This is a long, quiet walk into the deep past of a single strange animal, and you're welcome to fall asleep somewhere along the way. To understand why a careful scientist would picture a land animal as a swimmer and lay its plates flat when they in fact stood upright, you have to understand the peculiar fever that gripped American paleontology in those years. Marsh did not work in calm. He worked in a war. Historians of science call it the Bone Wars, and the name is not much of an exaggeration. There were two men at the centre of it. Othniel Charles Marsh worked out of Yale, backed by family money and a growing museum he intended to fill. Against him stood Edward Drinker Cope, a brilliant, restless naturalist from Philadelphia, quick where Marsh was methodical, and every bit as hungry for new species. The two had once been something close to friends. That had curdled. By the time Stegosaurus came out of the Colorado rock, the two men were locked in a rivalry so bitter that it shaped how bones were dug, how they were shipped, how they were described, and how quickly, far too quickly, they were rushed into print. The prize they fought over lay in the rocks of the American West, in a great sheet of late Jurassic stone that geologists would come to call the Morrison Formation, named for that same small Colorado town. Under the dry hills and along the eroding ridges, the West held bones in a richness no one had ever seen. Whole graveyards of giants lay just under the surface, weathering out into the daylight. And whoever named a new creature first, whoever got the description into a scientific journal ahead of the other, owned that discovery in the permanent record of the science. Priority was everything. Speed was everything. Care, too often, came second. So the two camps raced. They hired crews of diggers and sent them into the field with orders to work fast and ship faster. They guarded their quarries and spied on each other, and in the worst of it, are said to have smashed fossils they could not carry rather than let the other man have them. Bones were pried loose before they were fully understood. Skeletons were pulled apart in the ground and boxed up mixed together. Descriptions were dashed off from partial material because a rival might be days away from the same conclusion. In that climate of haste, a scatter of odd plates and a fragment of arched spine might well suggest a swimming animal to a man with no time to wait for the rest of the skeleton to arrive. Much of the richest ground lay in Wyoming, along a low, dry, unremarkable ridge that would become one of the most important fossil sites in the world, Como Bluff. It runs for miles across the high plains, a long spine of Morrison rock, and it proved to be packed with the bones of the Jurassic. From Como Bluff came sauropods and predators and armoured browsers in astonishing number. Marsh had men working the bluff almost continuously, sending crate after crate east by rail. It was from Como Bluff material, in 1879, that Marsh would name a second, larger kind of the plated animal, Stegosaurus ungulatus, a species that some estimates push close to 30 feet in length, among the longest of all its kind. But the first name, the original name, came from those poorer Colorado scraps in 1877. Stegosaurus armatus, Marsh called that first one, the armoured roof lizard. And here the haste of bone wars left a scar that has never quite healed. The type material, the very bones that anchor the name to a real specimen, were so fragmentary, so incomplete, that later scientists could not confidently tell them apart from other kinds of the animal. More than a century afterward, in 2010, the paleontologist Peter Galton would argue that this original type was simply too poor to diagnose, a name attached to bones that could not do the work a name requires. He petitioned to move the anchor of the whole genus onto a better specimen instead. That quiet argument, born in the rush of 1877, is still not fully settled among specialists. We will not settle it either. But it is worth knowing that the most famous plated dinosaur in the world rests its name, in part, on a handful of bones a hurried man could barely read. Picture Marsh at his work in those first months. He has the plates, he has pieces of the great arched back, the line of the spine that rises steeply from the shoulders toward the hips. He has fragments, not a skeleton, not an articulated animal lying as it died with every bone in its proper place. He has a puzzle with most of its pieces missing, and a rival breathing down his neck, and a journal deadline, and no living creature anywhere on Earth shaped quite like the thing these bones imply. So he reasons his way to the closest familiar form he knows, a turtle, a broad low body armoured on top, plates that lie flat and overlap, shingle over shingle protecting the back the way a roof protects a house. It is wrong. It is also, given what he had, not a foolish guess. It is what a careful mind does with too little evidence and too little time, and the plates lying flat is only half the first mistake. Marsh also leaned in those early years toward the idea that the animal spent its life in water. The reasoning ran along the same lines: a heavy, oddly built body, an armoured back, a shape unlike any land animal then known. Water would carry the weight. Water would explain the strangeness. For a little while, in the mind of the man who named it, Stegosaurus paddled through Jurassic shallows like some great plated turtle, its shingled armour breaking the surface. The correction came the only way such corrections ever come. It came from better bones. As the quarries of Colorado and Wyoming kept giving up their dead, more complete specimens began to reach the museums, and a more complete specimen tells a different kind of truth than a scatter of fragments. When bones are found articulated, still joined in the arrangement they held in life, or nearly so, they stop being a puzzle to be guessed at and become a record to be read. The turning point for Stegosaurus arrived in 1886 from a quarry near Cannon City, Colorado. There, workers uncovered a skeleton far more complete than anything Marsh had seen before, enough of the animal preserved together to show how its body had actually been built. This specimen would anchor the species we now call Stegosaurus stenops, the narrow-faced roof lizard, and it remains the creature most people picture when they hear the name. It gave the science its best skulls and its clearest sense of the whole animal, and it began, slowly, to overturn the first picture. The plates, it turned out, had not lain flat at all. In an articulated animal, in bones preserved close to their living positions, the plates rose. They stood upright along the spine, tall and thin, their broad faces turned out to the sides rather than lying down across the back like tiles. The shingled roof of Marsh's imagination lifted over the working lifetimes of many scientists into two standing rows of bony blades running from the neck down the arched back and toward the tail. The swimmer walked. The turtle stood up. Even then the picture kept refining itself, because that is how the work goes. For a long while it was assumed the plates rose in neat matched pairs, one on the left directly across from its twin on the right, like a row of headstones set 2 by 2. But as more articulated material was studied, that assumption fell as well. The plates did not pair off across the midline, they alternated. Each plate on one side sat offset from the plates on the other, staggered down the back in 2 interleaving rows rather than mirrored ranks. Why they were arranged this way, and what the arrangement was for, would become a riddle of its own, one that would outlast Marsh by more than 100 years. But the fact of the stagger came from the bones, patiently, once there were enough of them lying in the ground in the order the animal had worn them. Think for a moment about how much changed, and how little drama attended the changing. There was no single afternoon when the truth arrived. There was only a slow accumulation of better specimens, each one nudging the reconstruction closer to the living animal, each correction quiet and cumulative. The flat became upright. The paired became staggered. The swimmer became a walker of dry seasonal floodplains, and the name, Stegosaurus, roof lizard, stayed fixed to the animal even after the roof it described had been dismantled, a small fossil of a mistake carried permanently in the creature's own title. Names in this science are sticky things. They outlive the ideas that make them. This is the pattern you will meet again and again as we go deeper into this animal, so it is worth sitting with tonight. The bones come first, broken and partial and easy to misread. A picture is built, often wrong. Better bones arrive. The picture bends toward them. And still, always, some questions remain open, held gently in the honest word we'll use often here, contested. There is no shame in that word. It is the sound of a science being careful. Where the answer is genuinely unknown, we will say so and let it stay unknown, and you can rest inside the not knowing rather than being handed a false certainty to swallow. That is the tone of this whole long walk, calm, unhurried, honest about the edges of what the bones can tell us. We are not here to win an old argument between two rival men, or to pretend that a creature dead for 150 million years has given up all its secrets. We are here to stand beside it in the warm Jurassic light and look at it slowly, the way you might look at something in a dim museum hall late in the evening, with no one hurrying you along. And what a thing there is to look at, because once you set aside the flat plates and the imagined water, once you let the corrected animal stand up in front of you, Stegosaurus does not become ordinary. It becomes stranger. This is the deep pleasure of the creature. Every fix to the reconstruction reveals not a plainer animal but a more puzzling one. A body the size of a small truck, a head almost comically too small for it, slung low to the ground, a back that arches steeply upward toward the hips, so the whole animal seems tipped forward, browsing. 2 rows of tall bony plates rising along the spine, staggered, blood-grooved, useless as armour and mysterious in purpose, and a tail that ends in long spikes, 4 of them, the one part of this animal whose function almost no one doubts. It is a body assembled, it can seem, from spare parts of several different creatures, and the science has spent nearly a century and a half trying to work out why each piece is shaped the way it is. Marsh got the name and much of the fame. He did not get the answers. In many cases we still do not have them. What we have are the bones, more of them every decade, and the slow discipline of reading them without forcing them to say more than they can. Let the scale settle into your body before we go on, because scale is where these old animals stop being pictures and start being real. Take that largest back plate, the tall bony blade standing close to 2 feet high along the spine. Hold your own arm up in the dark and measure it in your mind from the point of your elbow to the tips of your fingers. That whole length, elbow to fingertip, is about the height of a single plate. Now imagine a double row of those blades, staggered left and right, marching down a back longer than a car. That is the ridgeline of this animal against a Jurassic sky. And then hold in your mind the other end of the scale, the beginning of it. Every piece of that towering, plated, spike-tailed creature was first reconstructed, first named, first imagined as a swimmer, from bone chips small enough to gather in one closed hand. A fistful of broken rock in a museum in Connecticut, and out of it a whole lost animal. Wrongly at first, and then, slowly, more rightly. There is something worth carrying into sleep in that. How little it takes to begin to know a thing, how much patience it takes to know it well. The men who fought over these bones are long gone, and their war has faded into the quiet footnotes of the science. Marsh and Cope raced each other into exhaustion and near ruin, and left behind, between them, a great mountain of the American Jurassic, hundreds of species pulled from the ground in too much haste and sorted out, painstakingly, by everyone who came after. Como Bluff still runs across the Wyoming plains. Cannon City still sits below its Colorado quarries. The rock still holds more than has been found, and the roof lizard, misnamed and corrected and misnamed again, still stands at the centre of one of the longest-running puzzles in paleontology, its plates upright now, its purpose still argued, its small head bent to the ferns. We will follow all of it in the hours ahead. The strange anatomy, bone by bone. The century of debate over what those plates were for. The seasonal, semi-arid Jurassic world it moved through, and the giants, and the one great predator it shared that world with. The single fossil that finally turned the tale from ornament into proven weapon, and the family of plated animals it belongs to, spread across continents and deep time. There is no rush to reach any of it. Everything will be here when you wake, and everything will be here if you do not. That fight over what to call the animal did not begin in a museum. It began in the field, in a hurry, with two men who could not stand each other. Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope had once been friendly. By the 1870s they were rivals in the fullest sense, racing to name more extinct creatures than the other could. Historians later called their feud the Bone Wars, and the name fits. They bribed crews, intercepted shipments, and rushed descriptions into print before the bones were fully cleaned. Speed was the whole strategy, and speed leaves marks. A fossil pulled from rock too fast, described too fast, often gets pictured wrong. That is exactly what happened at the start. In 1871, near the small town of Morrison, Colorado, a partial skeleton reached Marsh. He gave it a name that has outlasted every argument since: Stegosaurus, roof lizard. He chose the word believing the great bony plates had lain flat across the back like overlapping shingles on a roof. He was wrong about the pose, and he suspected the animal might even have been aquatic. But he was working from scraps. The Morrison material was too fragmentary to show him the living shape. He named the type species Stegosaurus armatus from those pieces, and that single decision, made quickly in the heat of the race, would haunt the science for well over a century. Understand what a type specimen is, because the whole tangle hangs on it. When you name a new kind of animal, you tie the name to one particular set of bones. That specimen becomes the anchor. Every later fossil is compared back to it to decide whether it belongs. The system works beautifully when the anchor is good. It fails quietly when the anchor is a handful of undiagnostic pieces that could belong to almost anything closely related. Marsh did not stop at one site. Word soon reached him of a place in southeastern Wyoming that would become one of the richest dinosaur graveyards ever worked. A long, low ridge called Como Bluff. The rock there gave up bones by the crate, season after season, a slow flood of the Late Jurassic pressed into stone. Marsh's crews shipped material east faster than anyone could study it. Some of it sat in drawers for decades before a careful eye returned to it. From that Como Bluff material, In 1879, Marsh named a second, larger kind, Stegosaurus ungulatus. This one grew toward the upper limit of the whole family, with length estimates reaching close to 30 feet, among the longest plated dinosaurs known. And here is the quiet irony of the race. The Como Bluff bones were often better, more complete, more useful for defining the animal than the fragmentary Colorado remains that carried the original name. The good anchor and the official anchor were not the same specimen. The problem simmered for generations while the popular image of Stegosaurus hardened into something everyone recognized: the arched back, the double row of plates, the spiked tail. But recognition is not the same as diagnosis. A child can point to a Stegosaurus in a picture book. A specialist trying to say precisely which bones separate one species from another has a much harder task, and the fragmentary type was very little help. That is the work Kenneth Carpenter and Peter Galton took up in a careful review, published in 2001. They went back through the North American Stegosaurus material, species by species, asking a plain and difficult question. For each named kind, is there something in these actual bones that lets you tell it apart from the others? For Stegosaurus stenops, the answer was yes. Its skeletons, including fine skulls, gave a clear picture. For Stegosaurus ungulatus, again yes, a valid and distinct larger form. But for Stegosaurus armatus, the original type, the animal that had given the entire genus its name, they ran into a wall. The type material was simply too poor. There was nothing in those fragments that let them point and say, this feature, and no other Stegosaurus, marks this species. The name that anchored everything rested on bones that could not do the one job an anchor exists to do. Picture the task they faced, because it is a strangely intimate kind of work. Sorting diagnostic scraps of bone is like feeling in a dark pocket for the one key that fits a lock you cannot see. Your fingers move over shape after shape. Most are the wrong bit, worn smooth, meaningful only by touch. You're searching for the single edge, the notch, the ridge that could only belong to one animal. And sometimes, when you finally close your hand around the piece the whole name depends on, you find it has no teeth at all. It fits nothing. It tells you nothing certain. That is the honest position the science reached. The founding specimen of Stegosaurus was, in the technical language, likely a nomen dubium, a doubtful name, not because the animal was not real, but because those particular bones could not prove which real animal they were. So Galton took the next logical step in a 2010 paper in the Swiss Journal of Geosciences. If the original anchor cannot hold, he argued, replace it with one that can. He petitioned to shift the name-bearing type of the genus away from the poorly known Stegosaurus armatus and onto Stegosaurus stenops instead, a species defined by excellent, near-complete skeletons. The proposal went to the body that governs these decisions, the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, filed as Case 3536. It sounds like paperwork, and in a sense it is, but sit with what it means. To stabilize the most famous plated dinosaur in the world, specialists had to formally ask permission to reground its very name on better bones. The creature was never in doubt. The scaffolding of names beneath it needed rebuilding while everyone watched. And this was not the only proposal on the table. A few years earlier, in 2008, Susanna Maidment and colleagues had put forward a broader revision of the plated dinosaurs. Their scheme would have merged several species, and even some separate genera, together under fewer names. It was a bold tidying of a messy group, but it did not win wide acceptance. Many specialists found it collapsed too much real variation into too few boxes, and the wider community did not adopt it. Hold both of those in mind at once, because together they show you something true about this field. Two thoughtful revisions published within a few years, pointing in nearly opposite directions, one asking to split the anchor cleanly onto a better specimen, one asking to lump many forms together, neither obviously foolish, neither instantly accepted. This is what a genuinely unresolved question looks like from the inside. Not chaos, but careful people disagreeing about how to read the same broken evidence. None of it changes the bones in the ground. The animal that walked the Morrison floodplain 150 million years ago knew nothing of type specimens or telegraphed claims, or the two men who would fight over its remains. It simply lived and browsed low among the ferns, and died and let the river silt close over it. Everything that came after, the racing crews, the crates from Como Bluff, the disputed name, the formal petition, all of that belongs to us, not to the creature. There is a lesson folded into the quarrel, and it is a gentle one for a mind drifting towards sleep. The first look at a thing, taken in haste, is often wrong. Marsh saw shingles lying flat and imagined a swimmer. The plates stood upright. He anchored a great name to scraps, and later hand spent lifetimes steadying what he had rushed. Science does not pretend those early errors never happened. It corrects them slowly, in print, one careful paper at a time, and it says out loud when it still does not know. So the honest summary is this. Two species, Stenops and Ungulatus, stand on firm ground. The original Armatus, the name-giver, rests on bones too fragmentary to be sure of, and the community has spent years deciding how to handle that gracefully. Whether every related plated form belongs inside Stegosaurus or deserves its own genus remains genuinely open. These are not settled matters dressed up as debate. They are real questions, still turning, still argued in the quiet way that specialists argue. You do not need to resolve any of it to picture the animal clearly. The naming fight is a human drama, layered over the creature like dust over a fossil, and it can be brushed aside. Beneath the arguments, the shape is patient and unchanged. The small head held low, the long back rising toward the hips, the plates in their double file, the spiked tail trailing behind. That shape waited in the rock through the whole feud, indifferent to who claimed it and what they called it. For now, set the old arguments aside and look instead at the animal itself, bone by bone, from the small head down the arched back to the spiked tail. For now, set the old arguments aside and look instead at the animal itself, bone by bone, from the small head down the arched back to the spiked tail. For now, set the old arguments aside and look instead at the animal itself, bone by bone, from the small head down the arched back to the spiked tail. Begin at the front, where the creature met its world. The first thing to notice is how little there is of it. For an animal that stretched some 21 to 23 feet from beak to spike tip, the head is startlingly, almost comically small. It rides low, slung close to the ground on a short neck, held well below the great arch of the back. If you stood beside a living Stegosaurus stenops, the head would hover somewhere around your knees, a long, narrow, tapering wedge of bone that seems to belong to a far smaller creature. Hold that image, because it is the first clue to everything else. The skull is only about 16 inches long, low and flattened from side to top, drawn out toward the front into a slender snout. There is no bulk to it, no crushing depth of jaw, none of the heavy machinery you might expect from a multi-ton plant-eater. It is a delicate instrument fitted onto an enormous body. And here is a way to feel it. A Stegosaurus skull is small enough to cradle in your two cupped hands, the way you might hold a little water drawn from a stream, the beak resting across your fingers, the back of the skull settling into your palms. Look now at the front of those jaws and you find something missing. There are no teeth there at all. The tip of the upper and lower jaw carried no teeth whatsoever, and in life this bare bone was almost certainly sheathed in a horny beak, a covering of keratin much like the beak of a modern tortoise or a bird. Paleontologists call this covering a rhamphotheca. It leaves no direct fossil of itself, since keratin rarely survives the long march of deep time, but the roughened, blood-fed texture of the bone beneath tells the story clearly enough. The animal cropped its food with a shearing edge, not with grasping teeth. Move further back along the jaw, past that empty cropping edge, and the teeth finally appear. They are small, triangular and low, ridged along their sides, set in modest rows well back in the cheeks. Compared to the animal that carried them, they are tiny things, each one about the size of a fingernail, arranged in a simple line rather than the tightly packed grinding batteries you would find in the mouth of a duck-billed dinosaur many millions of years later. These are the cheek teeth of a browser that did not chew much, and their surfaces show it. The wear on them is light. There are small facets where tooth met plant and plant met tooth, faint scuffing that speaks of some grinding, but nothing like the deep, punishing wear of an animal that spent its days pulverizing tough material. That light wear is not an accident of preservation. It is a window into how this creature ate. In 2010, the paleontologist Miriam Reichel built a biomechanical model of the Stegosaurus jaw, reconstructing the muscles and the leverage and the forces those small teeth could bring to bear. The result was a bite that was, frankly, weak. Not weak by the standards of a lizard or a small mammal, but strikingly weak for an animal of this size. The modelled bite force suggests the jaws could shear cleanly through twigs and soft stems only up to about half an inch thick. Anything sturdier, anything genuinely woody, would have resisted. Sit with what that implies. This was not an animal tearing into the trunks of conifers or stripping fibrous bark. It was a gentle processor of soft, low, fast-growing greenery, the tender ferns and the succulent stems and the leafy shoots that grew close to the ground. The beak cropped a mouthful, the small teeth gave it a light working over, and it went down. The whole feeding apparatus, from the toothless front to the modest cheek teeth to the weak but efficient bite, points in a single consistent direction toward the soft green carpet of the late Jurassic floodplain rather than the hard timber standing above it. Now lift your eyes from the head and let them travel back along the body, because the posture of this animal is as strange as its tiny mouth. Stegosaurus did not stand level. Its front and back halves were built to entirely different scales. The forelimbs are short and stocky, thick pillars of bone planted close beneath the shoulders, holding the front of the animal low. The hind limbs are another matter altogether. They are far longer, far more heavily built, tall columns that raise the hips high above the ground. The effect is a body that slopes and arches. The shoulders ride low, the hips ride high, and the spine between them rises in a great curving vault, cresting somewhere over the pelvis before the tail descends toward the ground behind. Picture a drawbridge caught halfway, or the slow arc of a hill seen from its foot. The head hangs at the bottom of that slope, which is exactly why it grays so near the earth. The whole architecture of the skeleton committed this animal to the low green, to the ferns and horsetails and cycads that grew at the height of your waist and below, rather than to the conifer canopy far overhead. There has long been a question of whether Stegosaurus could rise up out of that low posture, rearing back onto its hind legs and bracing on its heavy tail like a living tripod, lifting its small head into taller foliage. It is an appealing idea, and Marsh himself changed his mind about the animal's stance more than once during his lifetime. But it remains genuinely unresolved. Some reconstructions allow it, some doubt it, and the honest answer is that we do not know for certain whether this creature ever reached above the low green at all. For most of its day, the bones say, it stayed down where the soft plants grew. Before we go deeper into the body, one small invitation, offered quietly and only once. If these slow walks through deep time help carry you towards sleep, you can follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Nothing more is needed from you tonight. Let your breathing slow, and we will keep walking back through the bones together, unhurried, with the whole of the Jurassic still ahead of us. So we come to the head again, or rather to what was inside it, because this is where Stegosaurus earned one of the most famous and most misunderstood reputations in all of paleontology. The brain of this animal was small, genuinely, remarkably small. Estimates put it at roughly 2.5 to 3 ounces, somewhere around 70 to 80 grams, and that is the whole thinking organ for a creature that may have weighed well over 1.5 tons. You have heard perhaps that the Stegosaurus brain was the size of a walnut. It is a wonderful line, and it has been repeated for over a century, but it is an exaggeration. A brain of 70 to 80 grams is considerably larger than a walnut. It is closer, in fact, to the brain of a modern dog, a small and modest organ, yes, but not the pebble of legend. And here is the tactile truth of it, the thing to hold in your mind as you drift. A brain of that weight would sit lightly in your open palm, a soft, warm handful, no heavier than a small apple resting against your skin. That was the entire command centre of one of the largest armoured animals of its age. Small as it was, that brain did its job. There is a temptation, always, to read a small brain as a sign of stupidity, but this animal survived for millions of years, cropped its ferns, tended its young, and defended itself against the great predators of its world. It did not need a large brain to do these things. It needed enough, and it had enough. The size of the brain is not a verdict on the animal. It is simply a measurement, one number among many, a light thing resting in your palm. But the smallness of that brain led directly to one of the strangest ideas in the history of the science, and it is worth telling slowly. When Marsh studied the hips of Stegosaurus, he found something curious. In the region of the pelvis, where the spinal cord ran through the fused bones of the sacrum, there was a cavity, an expanded space far larger than the little brain case up in the skull. In some reconstructions, this hip cavity looked to be 20 times the volume of the brain itself. To Marsh, and to many who followed him, this seemed to demand an explanation. How could so vast a body with such a tiny brain up front coordinate the movements of its powerful hind limbs and its heavy spiked tail, all of it so far from the head? And so the idea was born that Stegosaurus carried a second brain, a kind of auxiliary control station set in the hips, taking over the management of the back half of the animal where the messages from the true brain arrived too slow and too faint. It was a marvellous notion. A dinosaur with a brain in its head and another brain near its tail, two minds running one enormous body. The idea took hold in the popular imagination and never quite let go. You may have heard it yourself, the animal that thought with its backside, the creature so long it needed a spare brain to reach the far end. It is one of those facts that is too charming to die, but it is not true, and scientists abandoned it as a literal second brain soon after it was proposed, because there was simply no evidence that any nervous tissue in that cavity ever functioned as a brain. Nerve ganglia do not think. They relay and reflex. They do not reason or command in the way a brain does. So what was actually in that space? The honest answer is that we are still not entirely certain, and it is a fine example of how paleontology holds its uncertainties in the open. The leading interpretation today is that the enlarged canal in the hips housed a glycogen body, a structure found in modern birds along the spine near the pelvis, a store of glycogen that may feed the nervous system, though its precise function even in living birds is not fully understood. Others suggest it held an enlarged nerve ganglion, a swelling of the spinal cord that helped service the hind limbs and tail, much as similar expansions appear in other large-bodied animals. It was very likely some combination of these, some real anatomical feature serving a real purpose, but not a second brain in any true sense. What we can say is this: the cavity was real. Marsh saw it correctly. It was his interpretation that went astray, reaching for a mind where the body only kept a reservoir or a relay, and the fact that its exact role is still debated, still not fully settled, is not a failure of the science. It is simply what it looks like to be honest about a creature dead for 150 million years, whose soft tissues rotted away long before any careful eye could study them. We have the empty space in the bone. We are still working out what filled it. Follow the spine on past those hips, and it slopes down at last into the tail, and the tail is where this gentle, small-headed, weak-jawed browser reveals a very different side of itself. Because at the end of that tail, Stegosaurus carried weapons. 2 pairs of long, sharp, bony spikes projected out and back from near the tail tip. 4 spikes in all, arranged in a splayed cluster, that fanned out from the final stretch of the tail. In Stegosaurus sternops, each of these spikes measured roughly 2 to 3 feet in length, tapering from a broad base to a genuine point. Think about the scale of that. Each spike was about as long as your arm from shoulder to fingertips, a solid cone of bone driven into the muscle of the tail, and there were 4 of them swinging together at the end of a tail muscled enough to move them fast. This arrangement has a nickname now, an affectionate one, born as a joke and adopted in earnest. But that is a thread for later. For now, simply hold the shape of it. 4 long spikes at the end of a heavy tail, the one part of this quiet animal that could truly hurt something. We will return to those spikes, to the question of whether they were only for defense and to the remarkable fossil that answered it. For the moment, they belong to the inventory of the body, one more strange feature on an animal built almost entirely out of strange features. The tiny head, the toothless beak, the weak jaws, the sloping arched back, the small brain, the empty cavity in the hips, and now the spiked tail. Every part of it seems to have been assembled from a different set of instructions, and so we come to the plates, which must be introduced here as anatomy, as bone, before they can be argued over as riddle. Run your eye along the top of that arch back, from the base of the neck to the beginning of the tail, and you find them, a double series of broad, flat, roughly triangular plates rising up out of the skin. In the largest individuals, the biggest of these plates stood up to about 2 feet tall, great leaf-shaped slabs of bone catching the Jurassic light along the crest of the animal's spine. The most important thing to understand about these plates is what they were not attached to. They were not part of the skeleton in the ordinary sense. They did not join to the vertebrae, did not lock into the spine, did not form a rigid crest fused to the backbone. They were osteoderms, bones that grow within the skin itself, embedded in the thick hide along the back and held in place by the flesh alone. When an animal like this died and its body decayed, the plates could fall away from the skeleton entirely, drifting loose from the bones they had ridden above in life. That single fact, that the plates floated free in the skin rather than bolting to the spine, is the reason their true arrangement stayed a puzzle for so long. When a Stegosaurus was found scattered, the plates lay where they had fallen, and it was left to careful hands to work out how they had stood in life. And the answer, once articulated skeletons were finally studied, turned out to be one of the animal's quiet surprises. For a long time, people assumed the 2 rows must be paired, each plate on the left matched by a twin directly across from it on the right, a mirror image running down the back like the teeth of 2 combs facing one another. They were not paired. The plates alternated. Each plate on one side sat not opposite its counterpart but in the gap between 2 plates on the other side, so that the 2 rows were offset, staggered, interlocking like footprints left by someone walking, left then right, then left, never quite side by side. It is a small detail and an oddly beautiful one, this zigzag of bones stepping down the spine, and it took articulated specimens to prove it against the older, tidier assumption of matched pairs. Look closely at the surface of those plates too, because it carries information. The bone is not smooth. It is riddled with grooves and channels, the traces of blood vessels that ran across and through the plates in life, feeding them, and, some suspect, doing a great deal more than merely feeding them. That dense plumbing of vessels is part of why the plates have generated so much argument, and it is a thread we will follow soon enough. For now, note only that these were living, blood-fed structures, not dry dead armour, warm to the touch, and laced with vessels close beneath the skin. Stand back, then, and take in the whole animal as the bones have shown it to you tonight. The small low head cradled near the ground, its toothless beak and its little ridged cheek teeth, built for soft green things. The weak jaws that could shear a twig no thicker than half an inch. The short forelimbs and the tall, powerful hind limbs, and the great arch of the back rising between them. The modest brain, a light handful in your palm, and the old myth of the second brain laid to rest, its cavity now read as a store or a relay whose exact purpose we are still, patiently, working out. The spiked tail with its 4 long weapons, and rising above it all the staggered double row of plates standing free in the skin, veined with blood vessels catching the light. You could spend a long night simply listing what makes this creature odd, and never run out of features. It is a chimera assembled from the low browser and the armoured fortress, the gentle grazer and the tailed weapon, the tiny thinker and the enormous body. Every bone tells a slightly different story, and somehow they all belong to one animal, moving slowly through the ferns of a world 150 million years gone. Consider how you might even begin to weigh an animal that has been dead for 150 million years. You cannot set it on a scale. The living bulk of it, the muscle and the fat, the skin and the gut and the slow tonnage of blood, all of that soft tissue rotted away in the first weeks after death, long before the bones began their patient turn to stone. What survives is the frame alone. And a bare frame by itself tells you surprisingly little about the weight it once carried through the ferns. So the weight has to be modelled. It has to be built back, guessed at, reasoned toward from the hard parts that remain. And here is the quiet trouble at the centre of it. The two main methods paleontologists use to weigh a dinosaur can disagree with each other by as much as a factor of 2. Not a few percent, double. One honest technique can hand you a Stegosaurus that weighs roughly half what another honest technique insists the very same animal must have weighed. Neither is lying. They are simply asking the question in different ways. The first way is called the volumetric method, and it works the way a sculptor works, in reverse. You take the skeleton, ideally a good one, and you treat it as an armature, a wire frame waiting to be fleshed. Around those bones you reconstruct the body as a 3-dimensional shape, a volume, drawing the outline of the flanks, the swell of the belly, the thickness of the thigh, the taper of the neck and tail. You are rebuilding the living silhouette in space. Then you measure the volume of that shape, how many cubic feet of animal it encloses, and you multiply that volume by a density, a figure for how heavy each cubic foot of living dinosaur would have been. Bone is dense, fat is light. Lungs and air sacs are lighter still, almost nothing. So the density you choose is itself an estimate, a careful average of a body that was never uniform. Do this to the right specimen, and the numbers become real. There is a young adult Stegosaurus stenops, catalogued under the label NHSMU R367 Truro, though the world came to know it by a gentler name. It is the most complete Stegosaurus ever pulled from the ground, something near 85 to 90% of the whole animal, more than 300 bones, and crucially they were preserved in 3 dimensions rather than crushed flat as fossils so often are. That completeness is a gift, because it means the reconstructed volume is not mostly guesswork. When researchers built the body back around that skeleton and applied a living density, the volumetric method returned a weight of roughly 1.56 to 2.16 metric tons. In the units your body knows, that is somewhere around 3,400 to 4,700 pounds. Call it the weight of a small rhinoceros, an animal you could stand beside and feel dwarfed by, and yet not one of the true giants of its world. Now hold that figure gently, because the second method is about to move it. The second way is called the linear bivariate method, and it does not care about volume at all. It cares about strength. The idea underneath it is simple and almost tactile. A leg bone has to hold up the animal that stands on it. The heavier the animal, the thicker and stronger its weight-bearing bones must be, or they would snap under their owner. So you can turn that logic around. Measure the circumference of the major limb bones, the femur and the humerus, the pillars that carried the load. Then compare those measurements against a large sample of living animals, creatures we can actually weigh, whose leg bones we can actually wrap a tape around. From that comparison you build a scaling relationship, a line that connects bone thickness to body mass, and you read your dinosaur off of it. It is an elegant idea, grounded in the physics of standing up. But it tends to give you a heavier animal. When the linear bivariate approach is applied to the larger individuals of the genus, The bigger, older Stegosaurus that lie at the top end of the size range, the figures climb. They reach up toward 2,700 to 4,000 kilograms, which in imperial terms is roughly 5,050 to 8,020 pounds, nearly 9,000 pounds at the extreme. That is not a small rhinoceros anymore. That is well past it. So you can see the puzzle plainly now. One Stegosaurus, weighed 2 honest ways, can carry 2 very different weights, and the gap between them is not a rounding error, but a near doubling. Part of the difference is that the methods are often being applied to different individuals, the small, complete subadult on one hand, the largest robust adults on the other. But even for animals of the same size, the volumetric and the linear approaches lean in different directions, and neither can be crowned as simply correct. Why does the linear method run heavy? In part because limb bones are conservative. They are built with a safety margin, engineered to survive not just standing but running, stumbling, twisting, the shove of arrival, the panic of a bad day. A bone thickened for those worst moments will, read backward, suggest a heavier, everyday animal than the creature truly was. And why might the volumetric method run light? Because it depends entirely on the fleshy outline you choose to draw, and on the density you assign, and reasonable people draw leaner or fuller bodies, and pick lighter or heavier densities, and each choice quietly moves the tonnage. This is the honest heart of it, and it is worth saying slowly because it runs against the way we like our facts. There is no single true weight for Stegosaurus waiting to be discovered. There is no lost number written on the animal that we simply have not found yet. Weight for a creature known only from its skeleton is not measured. It is inferred, and inference comes with a range. When one book tells you a Stegosaurus weighed 2 tons and another tells you 4, they are not contradicting each other so much as showing you the honest width of what the bones permit. The responsible figure is a spread, not a point. The bones do offer one more clue, though, a slower and stranger one. In 2009, a study looked not at the shape of the skeleton but at its microscopic grain, the internal architecture of the long bones and the girdle bones, red like the rings of a tree. Bone lays itself down in patterns that record how fast it grew, and that histology suggested that Stegosaurus grew more slowly than many other dinosaurs of comparable size, and hinted that it may have run at a lower metabolic rate, a cooler and more patient engine inside that bulky frame. The same study found that the plates and the tail spikes grew more slowly still, lagging behind the rest of the body, only catching up to full size as the animal neared adulthood. A young Stegosaurus, then, wore modest plates on a body that was still filling out, so the weight you infer is not only uncertain in the moment, it is a moving target across a life, a body that added its mass unevenly and without hurry over years. There is a way to feel all of this in your own hands, and it is the truest picture of what weighing a dinosaur actually asks of you. Imagine the bare skeleton laid out before you, clean and dry and light, and imagine a great heap of soft grey clay beside it. To find the weight, you have to pack the clay back onto the frame by hand. You press it around each vertebra, build the slabs of muscle along the hips and the tail, thumb it into the hollows of the ribs, smooth it out to the living contour. But how thick do you lay it? Over the thigh you might press it down to the depth of your own palm laid flat, several careful inches of muscle, and over the flank a little less, and along the spine less again. Every one of those thicknesses is a decision, and every decision is a guess, and the sum of all your guessing is the number on the scale. Lay the clay a palm deep and you get one animal. Lay it 2 fingers thinner across the whole body, and you have shaved a rhinoceros worth of doubt off the total. That is the volumetric method, felt from the inside, and the linear method is the quieter voice at your shoulder saying, never mind the clay, look at how thick the leg bone is, and trust that instead. Both voices are worth listening to, neither gets the last word. The weight of the plated giant, like so much about it, comes to us not as a fact carved in stone but as a careful range, honestly stated, openly uncertain, and all the more trustworthy for admitting where the certainty runs out. And the weight is only one of the arguments the skeleton has handed down to us. Bone by bone, this animal has kept paleontologists talking for a century and a half, disagreeing gently over posture, over diet, over how fast it grew and how it held its tail. And of all those bones, none has started more arguments than the two staggered rows of plates rising along the spine. And of all those bones, none has started more arguments than the two staggered rows of plates rising along the spine. Picture them now, in the quiet. A line of flat bony blades running from the base of the skull down toward the hips, the tallest near the middle of the back, standing up to about 2 feet high. Taller than they are thick, broad and leaf-shaped and strangely thin at the edges. For nearly a century and a half, people who study these animals have looked at that line of plates and asked the same simple question, over and over, in different words. What were they for? And the honest answer, the one we still give today, is that we are not entirely sure. Stay with that uncertainty for a moment, because it is not a failure. It is the shape of real science moving slowly through deep time. Before we walk through the guesses, sit with the object itself. Let your attention settle on a single plate. It was not part of the skeleton in the way a rib or a thigh bone is. It did not lock into the spine. Instead, it was an osteoderm, a plate of bone that grew inside the skin, rooted in the tissue along the back rather than fused to the vertebrae beneath. If you had been able to press a hand against a living Stegosaurus, you would have felt the plate held in the hide, anchored by soft tissue, not bolted to the frame. That single detail matters more than it first seems. It shapes almost everything we can and cannot say about what these plates did. Now look closer at the surface of one. It is not smooth. The bone is carved with long, shallow channels, a branching network of grooves that once carried blood vessels across the face of the plate. Run your eye along them and you can see them fork and thin and rejoin. Here is the first of the images to keep with you tonight. A plate's grooved surface is like the back of your own hand, the place where the veins rise faintly under thin skin, blue channels branching toward the knuckles, close enough to the surface that you can trace them without pressing. That is what the outside of a Stegosaurus plate looked like, in bone. A landscape built for blood to travel through, near the surface, where the outside world could reach it. That single fact, the grooves for blood vessels, is the seed of almost every theory. So let us lay the theories out, calmly, one at a time, the way they were laid out across generations of argument. The first idea, and for a long time the most famous, was temperature, thermoregulation. The reasoning is easy to follow. Here is a large cold-blooded animal, or at least an animal that could not warm itself the way a mammal does, living under a hot Jurassic sun. Here are broad, thin plates full of blood vessels, standing up into the air along its back. What if they worked like radiators? In the cool of the morning, the animal turns its flank to the low sun, and blood moving through those plates soaks up warmth and carries it inward, raising the body toward working temperature. In the heat of the afternoon, the animal turns edge on to the sun and stands in a breeze, and the same plates shed heat, the moving blood dumping warmth into the passing air. A living heat exchanger standing up along the spine. It is a lovely idea, and for decades it was taught almost as fact. The staggered, alternating arrangement even seemed to help, because plates that do not line up directly across from one another might catch a crosswind more efficiently, each one exposed rather than shielded by its neighbour. Some researchers compared the plate surface to the ears of an elephant or the fin along the back of certain other reptiles, structures that really do move heat. The blood vessel grooves were the physical evidence, right there in the bone. But the temperature idea has always had a problem, and the problem grew as people looked harder. Not every stegosaur had big, broad plates. Close relatives across the world carried narrow spikes instead of wide blades, and spikes make poor radiators because they have far less surface for their volume. If plates existed mainly to manage heat, why would some members of the family trade nearly all their surface away for points? and within Stegosaurus itself, the plates are largest exactly where a radiator would matter least, over the thick core of the body, and they shrink toward the neck and tail where a smaller animal might most need help. The numbers did not quite add up, so thermoregulation slid, over the years, from leading explanation towards something quieter. Not wrong, necessarily, just probably not the whole reason, and probably not the first reason. Which brings us to the second idea, the one that carries the most weight today: display, the plates as a signal, something to be seen. Think again about that wall of bone standing up along the back. From the side, a Stegosaurus becomes enormous, its outline doubled in height by the plates, a silhouette you could read across a wide floodplain. An animal with plates looks bigger, looks stranger, looks unmistakably like its own kind and no other, and that may be the point. In a landscape shared by many large plant-eaters, an animal needs to recognize its own species, to find mates, to know friend from stranger at a distance. A tall row of plates along the spine is a billboard of identity. It says, "From far off, across the ferns, exactly what you are." This is species recognition, and it blends into a second layer individual display. A healthy animal in good condition might carry taller, brighter, better plates. A rival might read them and think twice. A potential mate might read them and draw closer. You do not need the plates to do anything physical at all for this to work. They only need to be seen and remembered and compared. Now return to those blood vessel grooves, because display gives them a second and more dramatic job. Blood carries colour. Skin rich with vessels can flush. Some researchers have proposed that a living Stegosaurus could pump blood into its plates and change their appearance, the pale bone-backed skin warming into a visible blush of colour along the whole spine, a slow-motion signal rising and fading with the animal's state. Imagine standing at a distance and watching a line of plates deepen in colour from neck to hip. A signal you could see, but not hear, spreading down the back like light moving along a ridge. We cannot prove that happened. Soft tissue colour does not fossilise, and the flush is an inference, not a fact. But the plumbing was there, in the grooves, and a structure built to move blood near the surface is a structure that could, in principle, be seen to change. Here the two leading ideas quietly shake hands. A plate rich in blood vessels could shed heat and show colour, both without contradiction. This is why you will often hear the modern position stated as a blend. Display as the primary purpose, the reason the plates got so large and so visible in the first place, with heat exchange as a secondary or even passive effect. A useful side benefit of having big blood-filled surfaces standing in the air. The plates did not have to choose. Evolution rarely makes things for one reason alone. That is roughly where the science leans now, and it is worth saying plainly that leaning is not the same as knowing. This remains an open research area. Careful people still disagree about how much of the plate was display and how much was temperature, about whether the colour change idea is real or too generous, about what the grooves truly tell us. Nothing here is closed. When you hear someone state the answer with total confidence, in either direction, they are running ahead of the evidence. The calm truth is that we hold several possibilities at once and we weigh them, and we wait for better bones. If you are finding this slow walk through old arguments a good place to rest, stay with us here in the deep past. There is more to sit with, and no hurry to reach it. Now for the idea that has mostly left the room: defense. For a long time it seemed obvious. Big spiky plates on the back of a plant-eater, in a world full of large predators, surely those were armour. Surely they protected the animal from teeth. It is the first thing many people still guess, and it is, most likely, wrong. Look again at how the plates were built and where they sat. They were thin. Thin bone carved through with vessel grooves is not what you want between a predator's jaws and your spine. A shield is thick and solid. These were more like blades of stiffened skin than like a suit of armour, and they stood straight up along the top of the back, over the spine, guarding the one line an attacker was least likely to reach, and leaving the flanks, belly, the legs, the throat, all the soft places completely open. Armour that covers only the ridge of the back and covers it with thin brittle plates is not much armour at all. The staggered arrangement makes the case even stronger. Remember that the plates alternate left and right, offset rather than paired directly across from each other. A defensive wall would want the opposite. It would want solid coverage, plates meeting edge to edge, no gaps. Instead, there are gaps by design, each plate standing alone in its own slot along the spine. The very feature that helps a display, standing each plate clear so it can be seen and might help a radiator, standing each plate clear so air can move around it, is exactly what ruins it as a shield. So the staggered rows, once you understand them, argue against defense rather than for it. The plates say, "Look at me," or possibly "Cool me," but they do not say "Protect me." That job, the real defense, belonged elsewhere on the body, and we will come to it in time. So the plates fall out of the running as armour, and we are left holding display and heat, braided together, with heat the junior partner and nothing fully settled. That could be where the riddle rests. But there is one more thread, and it is the strangest and most beautiful of all, because it suggests the plates may have been telling us not only what species an animal was, but which sex. In 2015, a researcher named Evan Seita published a study that sent a quiet shock through the small world of stegosaur specialists. He had been working with plates from a bone bed in central Montana, a site preserving many individuals of a single kind of stegosaur, a form usually called Stegosaurus myosi, closely related to and sometimes folded in the Stegosaurus itself. A bone bed like that is rare and precious. It gives you not one animal, but a crowd, many individuals of the same species, the same place, the same slice of time. And when Saita measured their plates carefully, comparing shape with precise geometry, he found something that should not have been there if all these animals were simply the same. The plates came in two distinct kinds, two morphs. One was wide and rounded, a broad oval blade with roughly 45% more surface area than the other. The other was tall and narrow, a pointed blade rising higher than it spread. Wide and oval, or tall and narrow. And here is the part that made people sit up. There were almost no in-between shapes, not a smooth range from narrow to wide, the way you would expect if the difference were just age, or individual quirk, or random variation across a population. Two clusters, with a gap between them. Some animals wore one kind of plate, some wore the other. Very few, if any, wore something halfway. Let this be the second image to carry into sleep because it makes the difference plain. Hold up your own flat open palm, fingers together, wide and rounded. That is the shape of the broad oval plate, generous, spread out, catching the light across its whole face. Now beside it, raise a single pointing finger, tall and slim and rising to a point. That is the tall narrow plate. Set the flat open palm beside the single pointing finger, and you have the two kinds side by side, as different as those two shapes of your own hand, with almost nothing standing between them. When a trait in a single species sorts cleanly into two forms with no bridge, biologists have a short list of things it usually means, and near the top of that list is sex. Males and females of the same animal often differ in exactly this way, one form and another, with the gap between them holding steady. Think of the tail of a peacock against the plainer peahen, or the antlers a stag carries that the doe does not. So Seita read the two plate shapes as possible evidence of sexual dimorphism, a physical difference between males and females written into the plates themselves. Perhaps the wide oval plates with their greater surface belonged to one sex, and served as the larger billboard, the bigger signal in the contests of mating. Perhaps the tall narrow plates belonged to the other. We cannot say for certain which was which, only that two kinds existed, cleanly divided in one species. If that reading holds, it is a wonderful thing to know. It would mean that when you looked out across a group of these animals, You could tell males from females at a glance, by the shape of the bones standing along their spines. It would turn the plates from a single riddle into a kind of quiet language, one that spoke not only of species but of sex across the open ground. But hold that wonder loosely, because this too is contested, and the honesty matters more than the thrill. Not everyone accepts the interpretation. There are other ways to read two plate shapes in one bone bed. The difference might track something other than sex. It might reflect variation we do not yet understand, or the mixing of animals at slightly different stages, or subtleties of how the bones were preserved and measured. Some specialists find the sexual dimorphism reading persuasive. Others want more sites, more individuals, more species tested the same way before they will accept it. That is not a weakness in the finding. It is the ordinary, patient friction of a field correcting itself. A single remarkable study opens a door. It does not by itself close the question. And so we arrive back where we began, holding a riddle that has outlived generations of the people who tried to solve it. The plates were osteoderm set in the skin, up to 2 feet tall, staggered along the spine, carved with channels for blood. They were most likely built to be seen, to say what an animal was and perhaps which sex it was, with heat exchange as a quieter secondary gift, and possibly a slow flush of colour moving along them in life. They were almost certainly not armour. And within a single species 2 clean shapes may mark the difference between male and female, though careful voices still argue the point. That is the full, honest shape of it. Several good ideas, braided and weighted, and no final verdict stamped across the top. There is a particular calm in that, if you let there be. We are so used to wanting the answer, the one clean fact that settles a thing forever. But the deep past does not always hand those over, and the plates of Stegosaurus are a fine place to practice sitting with not knowing. 150 million years lie between us and the last living animal that wore them. Everything we have is bone, and the faint pressure of soft tissue on bone, and the careful reasoning we can build on top. To hold 4 possibilities at once, and to say plainly which we favour and which we doubt, is not a lesser kind of understanding. It is the truest kind we have. The riddle is allowed to stay a riddle a while longer. You can rest inside it without needing it closed. But notice what all these ideas share underneath their disagreement. Every one of them display and recognition, and the slow flush of colour, and even the quiet work of shedding heat, only makes sense out in the open. A signal needs an audience and a distance to cross. A radiator needs sun and wind and the long, dry warmth of a particular kind of afternoon. The plates were never merely an object on an animal's back. They were an object in a place, tuned to a specific light, a specific heat, a specific crowd of other creatures moving across the same ground. You cannot really understand what the plates were doing until you understand where they were doing it. So let the arguments settle now, like dust drifting back down through still air. Let the measured plates and the 2 morphs and the century of debate grow quiet. We have looked as closely as the bone alone allows, and the bone alone has taken us as far as it can. To go further, we have to leave the museum drawer and the calipers behind, and step out under the ancient sun where these animals actually lived, breathing real air, standing on real ground, surrounded by the very audience the plates were built to face. Somewhere in the Badlands of central Montana, the ground gave up a small crowd of the dead at once. Not a single animal, but a scatter of them. A bone bed of the stegosaur that some paleontologists call Hesperosaurus myosi, and others fold into Stegosaurus itself as Stegosaurus myosi. They lay together in the same rock, from the same window of time, roughly 156 million years ago. And when a young researcher named Evan Saita measured their plates in 2015, he noticed something that a single skeleton could never have shown him. The plates came in 2 shapes, not a smooth range of shapes, blending one into the next. 2. One kind was wide and rounded, an oval that spread out low and broad along the back. The other was tall and narrow, rising to a point more like a raised blade than a spread fan. When he measured the surface area, the wide plates carried about 45% more skin-covered bone than the tall ones. That is not a subtle difference. Picture 2 plates of the same animal kind, and one of them offering nearly half again as much surface to the sun and to the eye. The detail that made this strange, rather than simply varied, was what sat between the 2 shapes. Nothing. No plates that were sort of wide and sort of tall. No halfway forms bridging the gap. In a population, most traits smear across a range. Height, weight, the length of a limb, these usually pile up in the middle and thin out at the edges, one continuous hill of variation. But here the plates fell into 2 separate clusters, with a clean valley between them, a bimodal split in the language of the study. 2 peaks, not one. That clean gap is what pulls the eye toward one particular reading, and it is worth sitting with why. When a single trait sorts a population into 2 tidy groups with nothing in between, the most familiar cause in living animals is sex. Think of the antlers of a deer, present in one sex, absent or reduced in the other. Think of the tail of a peacock, the mane of a lion, the bright throat of a lizard that the drab one lacks. These are display traits, ornaments that one sex carries and the other does not, or carries in a different form. They tend to produce exactly this kind of split, 2 shapes with a bare middle, because they answer to courtship and rivalry, rather than to the slow blur of ordinary growth. So the wide oval plates might have belonged to one sex, spreading a larger banner of skin and bone along the spine, the tall narrow plates to the other, both alive at once, in the same herd, in the same mud. It is a clean and satisfying picture, and you can feel why it took hold. The plates were already suspected of being display structures, ridged with grooves for blood vessels, possibly flushing with colour as blood moved through them, a signal running the length of the back. If they were billboards, then 2 designs of billboard, sorted without overlap, reads naturally as 2 sexes advertising in 2 ways. The bone bed, with many individuals frozen in one moment, is the rare kind of sample where such a pattern could even be seen. One skeleton tells you what one animal looked like. A graveyard can tell you how a population varied. And yet the calm thing to do here is to slow down, because a clean split does not prove its own cause. Sexual dimorphism is one explanation for 2 shapes with no middle. It is not the only one. This is where a careful listener has to hold several possibilities open at once, and let none of them close too early. Consider individual variation first. Animals differ from one another for reasons that have nothing to do with sex. 2 plates that look like 2 designs might simply be 2 ends of a range that happens, in this particular sample of the dead, to look more separated than it truly was. Small samples can lie about their own shape. Pull a dozen stones from a riverbed, and they might seem to come in 2 sizes, when the whole river holds every size between. Consider growth. A dinosaur did not hatch with its adult plates and simply enlarge them. Bone histology tells us that stegosaur plates and spikes grew more slowly than the rest of the skeleton, until the animal neared full size, changing proportion as they went. So a wide plate and a tall plate might not be a male and a female at all. They might be a younger animal and an older one, the shape shifting across a lifetime rather than across the sexes. If the 2 morphs mapped onto 2 ages, the split would still look clean, and it would still mislead. Consider species. The very name of this animal is unsettled. Some workers call it Hesperosaurus, some call it Stegosaurus myosi, and the boundaries between closely related stegosaurs are drawn and redrawn. If more than one kind of animal lay mingled in that Montana rock, then 2 plate shapes could mark 2 species sharing a floodplain, not 2 sexes sharing a herd. Bone beds do not always hold a single tidy population. Rivers gather what they gather, and under all of this sits the hardest problem of the fossil record. You cannot walk up to a 150-million-year-old skeleton and simply confirm its sex. In living animals, dimorphism is proven by knowing which individuals are male and which are female, and then seeing how their traits divide. In the rock, direct sexing is nearly impossible for an animal like this. There is no soft anatomy left, no reliable skeletal signature that says male here and female there. So the argument has to run backward, from the pattern to the presumed cause, and a pattern can have more than one parent. The study did look for other explanations, and argued the split held up better as dimorphism than as age or simple variation. But arguing is not the same as closing the question, and the authors of such work tend to know that best of all. So it stays open, and honestly it should. This is not a failure of the science. It is the science being careful with a kind of evidence that resists certainty. To move the question forward, you would want more than one bone bed, more sites in more places, so that the two-shape pattern could be tested against fresh samples, rather than resting on a single graveyard. You would want a way to tie plate shape to age with confidence, cutting into the bone to read each animal's growth, and asking whether the wide plates simply belong to the old and the tall plates to the young. You would want cleaner evidence that only one species lies in the rock. Any one of these could tip the balance. Until then, the two morphs are a real and measured fact, and their meaning is a reasonable argument rather than a settled answer. There is something restful, if you let it be, in a mystery held this honestly. The bones are not vague. The measurement is precise. 45% more surface on one shape than the other. Two clusters, no bridge between them. What resists us is not the data, but the leap from data to reason, the last quiet step from what plates were to why they differed. That step is where paleontology earns its patience. Hold the two shapes in your mind as if you were holding them in your hands, because the difference really is that plain to the touch. Imagine lifting the wide oval plate first. It sits in the palm like a broad river stone, smoothed and rounded, spreading its weight across your whole hand, low and generous and full. Now set it down and lift the other. The tall, narrow plate rests differently, long and thin and edged, a flat blade of slate that stands up rather than spreads out, its weight gathered along a line instead of across a surface. A river stone against a shard of slate. You would never mistake one for the other in the dark. That is how distinct the two forms were, and that clarity in the hand is exactly what makes their meaning so hard to pin down. The shapes are certain. The story they tell is not. Whether those two shapes divided the sexes or the ages or two kinds of animal, the plates were still doing something out in the open, under a hard Jurassic sun. They were surfaces meant to be seen, or to shed heat, or to signal, and every one of those purposes depended on the world pressing in around them. A plate is a plate in a museum drawer. On a living back, it answered to the air temperature, to the angle of the light, to the eyes of other stegosaurs across a fern flat, to the slow pulse of blood beneath the skin. The debate over these two morphs is really a debate about a living animal in a living place, and that place is the thing you have to enter next. To ask what the plates were truly for, you first have to stand inside the world they lived in, a hot Jurassic floodplain far from any ocean. To ask what the plates were truly for, you first have to stand inside the world they lived in, a hot Jurassic floodplain far from any ocean. So stand there now. Feel the ground under you, dry and cracked, the colour of old bone in the late afternoon light. This is the Morrison, a vast lowland that once stretched across what is now Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, laid down between roughly 155 and 150 million years ago. There is no ice anywhere on this planet. The poles hold no white caps, and the difference in temperature from equator to pole is gentler than the one you know. It is a warmer world, broadly, and a drier one, and the sun comes down on your shoulders with a flat, patient weight. Look around at what that heat has made. The land is semi-arid and markedly seasonal. For long stretches of the year, the rain simply does not come. The open ground turns dusty and pale, studded with low scrub, and the air smells of resin and warm earth. Then the season turns. Rivers that had shrunk to sluggish threads swell and spill, flooding the flats, laying down fresh silt, greening the margins in a slow pulse you could set a life by. So the country reads as a patchwork, dry open ground in one direction and threading through it, following every watercourse, long green corridors of ferns and horsetails and conifers. Those corridors are the arteries of this place. Nearly everything that lives here bends its day around them. Before you walk any deeper into it, let this be the small favour asked of you tonight. If this slow country suits you, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then let the request go and come back to the floodplain and to the animal moving quietly through it. Because you're not alone out here, a few dozen feet ahead, a Stegosaurus is feeding, and it has no idea you're watching. It is a big animal, an adult of the species called Stegosaurus stenops, something on the order of 21 to 23 feet long from beak to the tips of its tail spikes. It carries perhaps 300-500 pounds of body, roughly the weight of a small rhinoceros, though you should hold that number loosely, because estimates for animals this size can swing by nearly a factor of 2, depending on how the reconstruction is done. What matters right now is not the exact figure. What matters is the posture. The hips ride high, lifted on long, heavy hind limbs. The shoulders sit low, propped on short, stocky forelegs. The back arches between them like a slow hill, and the double row of plates runs along that ridge, staggered, not quite paired, alternating down the spine. And the head, the strange small head, hangs low to the ground. That low head tells you almost everything about how this animal eats. The skull is tiny for the body, slung close to the earth, and the neck is not built to lift it high. So the Stegosaurus works the bottom of the world. It sweeps its beaked face sideways through a stand of ferns that comes up to about your knee, and then through taller growth that reaches your shoulder, and it takes what grows there. Ferns, mostly. Low fern prairies spread across the wetter ground like a green carpet, and the animal moves through them with a slow, methodical patience, cropping as it goes. Listen to the sound of it. There is a soft rasping as the head pushes through the fronds, a papery brushing noise, and then, again and again, a small crisp shear as a stem is bitten clean through. Not a crunch, not the grinding you might expect from a giant. A shear. The front of those jaws carries no teeth at all. Instead, there was almost certainly a horny beak, a sheath of the same kind of material that covers a modern bird's bill, and that beak did the cutting. Further back sit small triangular cheek teeth, ridged, and their worn surfaces show they did some grinding. But not much. This was not an animal that chewed thoughtfully for hours. It sheared, it swallowed, it moved on. There is hard science under that picture. A study modelling the mechanics of the Stegosaurus jaw found a surprisingly weak bite, weak enough that the animal was probably limited to slicing through twigs and soft stems less than about half an inch thick. Think about what that rules out and what it invites. It rules out tough, woody browse, the hard branches and coarse material that a stronger jaw might tackle. It invites exactly what the floodplain offers in abundance: soft, fast-growing low-lying plants, fern fronds, the green shoots of horsetails clustered near water, the soft parts of cycads and the tender new growth of the season. This is a mouth built for tender things, carried low, on an animal built to spend its whole day near the ground. Watch it move, and you begin to feel the rhythm of that day. There is no hurry in it anywhere. The Stegosaurus takes a few steps, drops its head, sweeps, shears, swallows, lifts, steps again. The tail with its 4 long spikes drags a slow arc behind. The plates catch the light as the body turns, and their ridged surfaces, grooved with the channels that once carried blood vessels, seem almost to glow along the top edge when the sun hits them right. Some paleontologists have proposed that those plates could flush with colour as blood moved through them, a slow signal running the length of the spine. Whether that happened and what it might have meant is genuinely unsettled. But the image is worth holding. A row of living banners along the back of a browsing giant, warming and cooling and perhaps colouring in the long light of a Jurassic afternoon. Now here is a question the animal itself cannot answer for you, and neither quite can the fossils. Could it reach higher than this? Everything about the low skull and the short front leg says low browser, a creature of the ground and the shrub layer. But there has long been an idea that a Stegosaurus, when it wanted to, could rock back onto its hind legs and use that heavy, spiked tail as a third support, a tripod, propping itself up to strip foliage from taller plants overhead. It is not a foolish idea. The hind limbs are massive, far stronger than the forelimbs, and the hips are already the highest point of the standing animal. The centre of the body sits well back. In principle, the architecture is not hopeless for a slow, deliberate rear, and the debate around it has a certain history to it. Even Othniel Charles Marsh, the man who first named Stegosaurus back in 1877, changed his own mind about how the animal held itself and how it might have fed. He revised his thinking over the course of his own working life, and the question he wrestled with has never been fully put to rest. Modern researchers remain divided. Some picture the occasional tripod rear, a giant balancing back to reach the higher green. Others hold that Stegosaurus was a committed low browser and left the heights to others, and that the tripod pose, if it happened at all, was rare and brief. You are allowed to stand here in the uncertainty. It is honest ground. The bones simply do not settle it, and a careful voice will tell you so rather than pretend. But raise your eyes from the fern layer for a moment, because the heights are not empty. They belong to other animals, and the way this whole community divides up the green is one of the quiet marvels of the Morrison. Far across the flat, where the conifers rise into real canopy, you can see the necks, sauropods, the long-necked giants of this age, and there are several kinds sharing this single floodplain. There is Diplodocus, immensely long and low-slung, its neck held out ahead like a horizontal boom, sweeping wide arcs of low and middle brows. There is Apatosaurus, heavier in the neck and the shoulder, more massively built, working a similar zone with more brute mass behind it. There is Camarasaurus, boxier in the skull, with strong teeth suited to tougher plants, cropping at its own preferred height. And there is Brachiosaurus, built like nothing else, with the front legs longer than the back, so the whole body slopes up toward a neck that lifts the head far into the canopy, into green that nothing else here can even see, let alone reach. Think about what that arrangement means. You have a Stegosaurus working the fern layer at knee and shoulder height. You have different sauropods spread through the low, the middle, and the very high brows above it. Each animal is eating at a different level of the same forest. And that is precisely how so many large plant eaters can share one seasonal, sometimes stingy landscape without starving one another out. They are not all reaching for the same leaf. The tall feeders take the canopy the short feeder can never touch. The short feeder takes the ground layer the tall ones can barely be bothered to lower their heads for. Competition softens. The floodplain, sliced into horizontal bands of green, feeds them all. And you do not just see those giants, you feel them. This is the tactile heart of the place. A large sauropod sets its foot down somewhere out on the flat, hundreds of feet away, well beyond the range where you would hear much of anything over the wind. But the ground carries what the air does not. The impact travels through the packed earth and reaches you through the soles of your feet. A single low pulse felt more than heard, like a slow drum struck somewhere underground. Then, seconds later, another. The unhurried walking rhythm of an animal so heavy that each step becomes a small event in the crust of the world. You could stand with your eyes closed and know a herd was moving, just by the patient percussion coming up through your feet. That is the soundscape of the Morrison, and it is worth sitting inside for a moment, because it is so unlike the world you fall asleep in. There is no bird song. Birds as you know them are barely begun in this age, and the dawn does not ring with them. Instead, the air is filled with wind, a dry, steady wind moving through the fern prairies with a papery rattle, and moving through the stiff branches of the primitive conifers with a low, guttural creak. There is the trickle and slap of water at the river margins. There is the occasional distant rumble of a sauropod herd on the move, and under it all that felt drumbeat in the ground. An ancient quiet, but not a silence. A world humming to itself at frequencies your bones can pick up even when your ears cannot. The fern layer touches you as you walk through it. This is the low green world made physical. The fronds brush against your knees as you move, soft and cool where the shade holds a little moisture, dry and scratchy out where the sun has been on them all day. Push a little deeper, and the taller growth reaches your shoulder, and the horsetail stems, jointed and hollow, tap lightly against your arm as you part them. For the Stegosaurus, this is not scenery. This is the whole pantry, the entire working surface of its life, everything it needs held between the height of your knee and the height of your shoulder, spread out for miles along the green corridors of the flood country. Now, why does an animal live this slowly? Why the unhurried steps, the low patient sweep, the calm that seems built into every movement? For a long time that was just an impression, the way the reconstructions felt, but there is bone evidence underneath it now, and it comes from an unusual place, from cutting into the fossils and reading the growth written inside them. A study of Stegosaurus bone histology, published in 2009, sectioned the long bones and the girdle bones and the plates and spikes, and read the microscopic record of how this animal grew. The findings are quietly telling. The great plates and the tail spikes, those signature structures, grew more slowly than the rest of the skeleton, holding back, only reaching their full development as the animal approached adult size. The showy hardware came late, and more than that, the whole animal appears to have grown slowly overall, more slowly than many other dinosaurs of comparable size, which raises the real possibility that Stegosaurus ran at a lower metabolic rate than some of its neighbours. A slower engine, a longer, more patient path to adulthood. Sit with what that implies about the day you've been watching. A lower metabolic rate means a lower fuel demand, a body that did not need to burn through vast quantities of food at a frantic pace. And that fits the mouth exactly. A weak bite, a low reach, a diet of soft ferns and tender shoots, no long sessions of grinding tough material. This is not an animal built to eat fast and grow fast and live hot. It is an animal built to eat steadily, grow slowly, and move through its world at a pace that matches the patient, seasonal country it lived in. The anatomy, the diet, and the growth all tell the same story, and the story is one of unhurried endurance. That endurance would have been tested every year when the dry season came. Remember what this climate does. For long stretches the rain fails, the open flats go dusty and hard, and the easy green retreats. When that happens, the animals of the Morrison would have pulled toward the wetter places, the rivers that still ran, the low floodplain wetlands where the water table held closest to the surface, and the ferns stayed green longest. These were the refugia, the refuges, the dry season lifelines, a ribbon of living green threading through a browning land, and the herbivores drawing in toward it. But those lifelines carried their own cost, and here the calm of the day tightens by a single degree. The wet margins were also the exposed ground, the muddy river edges where cover thinned and sightlines opened, and many different animals were funneled into the same narrow strips of survival. Where the plant-eaters gathered, the meat-eater followed. Concentrate the prey along a shrinking green corridor, and you concentrate the danger there too. The very places that kept the herbivores alive through the drought were also the places where a hunting animal was most likely to find them. You have felt that danger at the edge of this whole scene without quite naming it, and it is time to name it. There is a shape out here that every browsing animal reads the landscape against. Its name is Allosaurus, the apex predator of the Morrison, a large and powerful hunter that shared these same rivers and fern flats, that walked the same seasons and drank from the same shrinking pools. You have not seen it yet in this quiet afternoon, but the Stegosaurus knows it is out there. You can read it in the way the big herbivore keeps turning, keeps orienting, keeps that spiked tail loose and ready even while its head is down in the ferns. The predator does not have to be visible to be present. Its presence is a constant low pressure on every animal here, a weight in the air that never quite lifts. And so you begin to understand the shape of a low browser's whole existence in this place. A hot, dry, seasonal floodplain far from any sea, long droughts broken by the green pulse of the floods, a slow-growing body with a modest engine, cropping soft ferns at knee and shoulder height, hour after unhurried hour, giant sauropods overhead, dividing the forest into bands of browse so that all of them might be fed, the felt drumbeat of heavy feet coming up through the ground, the wind in the ferns, the creak of the conifers, the absence of any bird song, and always, threaded through the green corridors that keep everyone alive, the quiet, patient pressure of a single hunting shape. The Stegosaurus lifts its head one more time before the light goes long and low. The plates catch that last warm angle of sun, and if they coloured at all, this is the hour they would have shown it. A slow flush running the ridge of the back above the ferns. It takes a few more steps, shears a few more stems, and settles toward the end of its ordinary, uneventful day, one of thousands of such days, in a life measured out in slow growth and soft green and patient miles. Let your own breath go slow to match it. There is nothing to hurry here. There never was. Pull your gaze back now, up and away, until the single feeding animal becomes one small shape among many on the wide floodplain, until the green corridors become thin, bright veins across a dusty land, until the whole seasonal world lies quiet under a warm and iceless sky, and the last of the light begins to fade away over the distant conifers. Stand still a moment in that world, and let it gather around you. The sun sits high and white overhead, a hard, bright disk in a pale sky, and it pours down with a steadiness you can feel on your skin. This is the Late Jurassic, roughly 150 million years back, and the planet you are standing on runs warmer than the one you know. There are no ice caps at the poles. The difference in temperature between the equator and the far north is gentler, flatter, less severe than today. Warmth spreads more evenly across the globe, and here on the Morrison floodplain spread beneath what will one day be called Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. That warmth means long stretches of dry, bright, patient days. Feel the air first. It is dry in a particular way, the kind of dry that reaches the back of your own throat after a long thirst. That faint, papery scrape when you swallow, and there is not quite enough moisture to make it easy. The heat does not come at you in gusts. It presses down evenly on your shoulders, a broad, warm weight resting there like a hand laid flat, unhurried, unmoving through the middle of the day. Dust lifts from the open ground when anything large moves across it, and hangs and drifts and settles again. For much of the year this is a thirsty land, a semi-arid plain where rain is a memory and a promise rather than a daily fact. But the year has a rhythm, and it swings. The dry season stretches long, and then the waters come, seasonal floods that spill across the low ground and turn dust to mud, and mud to shallow standing sheets. When they recede, they leave green behind them. So the land is not one thing but a patchwork. There are dusty open flats, pale and cracked and exposed, and threading through them, following the low channels where waters run, there are green corridors, ribbons of life that trace the old paths of the rivers. Walk the plain, and you cross from bare, bright openness into cool green, and back again, the way the ground remembers where the water goes. Now lower your eyes to the height of a browsing Stegosaurus, and look at what grows here. There is no grass. Grass has not yet spread across the world, and will not for tens of millions of years. Instead, the low green is made of older things. Ferns run in wide low prairies, frond upon frond, a soft knee-high sea that ripples when the wind moves through it. Among them stand horsetails, jointed and hollow-stemmed, clustered thick along the damp margins where their roots can drink. There are cycads, squat and stiff, their crowns of tough leaves fanning out from a barrel of a trunk. There are ginkgos, their fan-shaped leaves catching the light, ancestors of a tree that will still be alive in your own age, one of the few green threads that reaches all the way from here to there. And there are tree ferns, lifting their fronds higher on slender trunks, casting a thin dappled shade across the fern floor below. This is the world within reach of a low head. Everything a plated giant needs to eat lives between the ground and the height of your shoulder. Above that, the green changes hands. The conifers rise tall stands of primitive evergreens with narrow needled branches, and their canopies belong to other mouths. Those crowns are the feeding height of the long-necked sauropods, the giants who lift their heads on necks longer than the whole body of the animal browsing below. Diplodocus and Apatosaurus, Camarasaurus and Brachiosaurus, each reaching a different band of foliage, each taking a different slice of the vertical world so that they are not all fighting for the same mouthful. The forest is layered like shelves, and every animal knows its shelf. The low browser keeps to the ferns and the horsetails and the soft new growth near the ground, and leaves the high needles to the necks that can reach them. Listen now, because the sound of this world is one of the strangest things about it, and the easiest to get wrong. There is no birdsong. That bright chorus that fills your mornings, the trills and calls and layered melody of countless small voices, none of it exists yet. The birds are barely begun, and the air is not yet full of their music. So when you strip that away, what remains is older and simpler and lower. There is wind, and the wind has textures here. It moves through the primitive conifers and draws out a low guttural creak from their branches, a slow woody groan as limbs shift against one another. It passes across the fern prairies and lifts a dry, papery rattle from a million fronds, a soft, continuous whisper that rises and falls with the gusts. There is water somewhere near, the quiet run of a channel or the trickle at a river margin, threading its thin sound beneath everything, and under all of it, felt as much as heard, there is the low rumble of a distant sauropod herd. You do not hear their footfalls the way you hear the wind. You feel them, a slow, heavy percussion carried up through the ground into the soles of your feet, each footfall of a many-ton animal landing somewhere out beyond the tree line, a deep soft thud spaced out in the patient rhythm of something enormous in no particular hurry. It is a sound like distant weather, like something vast breathing at the edge of the world. That is the pulse of the Morrison. Wind, water, and the tread of giants, and almost nothing sharp or sudden laid over the top of it. Stay in it long enough, and you begin to understand how the year shapes every life here. Through the long dry season, the open flats bake and pale and crack, and the green retreats toward the water. The fern prairies thin. The dust deepens, and the animals follow the green where it goes, drawn down toward the wetter ground, the rivers and the floodplain wetlands that hold their moisture when everything around them has given it up. These are the refugees, the muddy margins and standing pools that stay alive through the driest months. They are the reason a herd survives from one rainy season to the next. Water gathers there. Soft new growth keeps coming there when the higher ground has gone brown and brittle. In a thirsty land, the wet places are the thread that life hangs on, but the same ground that keeps them alive is the ground that exposes them. Think about what a river margin is in a dry world. It is where everything must come. The low browsers come for the soft plants and the drink. The long necks come to wade and to drink, and every hunter on the floodplain knows exactly that. So the wetter refugia are a lifeline, and a trap folded into the same stretch of mud. The cover thins near the water. The open banks leave a large animal visible from a long way off, its dark shape standing plain against the pale, exposed flat. To reach what keeps you alive, you must stand where you can most easily be seen, and where the one who hunts you has learned, season after season, to wait. This is the tension woven quietly through every calm day here. The Morrison looks unhurried, and it is. The pace of it is slow, the giants patient, the sound low and steady, the heat pressing down even and mild through the long afternoons. A plated animal can spend hours with its beaked head down among the ferns, rasping and cropping, cutting the soft stems it can shear, moving a few slow steps and cropping again, and for most of those hours nothing at all disturbs the rhythm. The wind creaks in the conifers, the fronds rattle, the far-off herd rumbles through the soles of the feet, dust rises and settles, the sun rests its warm weight on the shoulders and does not move, and yet the exposed ground is always there, and the dry season always comes, and the water always draws the whole community down into the same narrow green corridors where the cover runs thin. The peace of this place is real, but it is a peace with an edge folded inside it, the way the driest air still carries the faint promise of the flood, the way the softest green ribbon still runs across the most open and watched of ground. To live here is to move slowly through long calm days, and to know, somewhere below thought, that calm is not the same as safe. The plates catch the light, the heat holds steady, the herd's slow tread comes up through the earth, and the low browsers keep to their fern-height world, cropping and stepping and cropping, patient animals in a patient land, sharing their rivers and their fern flats with something that shared them too. For all the crowded green of this floodplain, for all the giants moving through it at their different heights, the shape of that shared danger did not vary much from one river bend to the next. The same broad plain, the same dusty flats and green corridors, the same exposed banks where the water gathered, and moving through all of it, the one animal every herbivore learned to watch for, and in that patient, unhurried world, the greatest danger wore a single shape, and one day two animals left the proof of their meeting locked in the rock. And in that patient, unhurried world, the greatest danger wore a single shape, and one day two animals left the proof of their meeting locked in the rock. And in that patient, unhurried world, the greatest danger wore a single shape, and one day two animals left the proof of their meeting locked in the rock. The shape had a name, though no creature living then could speak it. Allosaurus fragilis, the apex predator of the Morrison Formation, the great meat-eater of these fern flats and river corridors, the animal whose presence pressed on every herbivore around it, like weather that never quite broke. You have followed the plated giant through its slow days. Now meet the thing that shared its ground. Picture the predator standing at the edge of a stand of horsetails in the low light of a Jurassic morning. It is built along different lines than the browser it hunts. Where Stegosaurus is a low, arched, deliberate machine of digestion, Allosaurus is long and balanced and fast, poised over two powerful hind legs, its spine held level like a drawn plank. Its head is deep and narrow, set with backward curving teeth, each one serrated along both edges the way a bread knife is serrated, made for slicing rather than crushing. It carries that head forward on a flexible neck. Above the eyes sit two low bony ridges, small crests of no certain purpose, catching the sun as the animal turns. This is the constant quiet pressure the herbivores lived beneath. Not a monster in every waking hour, but a fact of the landscape, the same way heat and thirst in the long dry season were facts. Allosaurus shared the same rivers, it walked the same fern prairies. It waited at the same muddy margins where the water drew everything down to drink in the parched months. For a Stegosaurus, safety was never a place you arrived at. It was a thing you carried on your own body, all day, in the four long spikes at the end of your tail. Those spikes have a name too, and it is one of the strangest names in all of science. The paleontologists call the cluster of tail spikes a thagomizer. It is a real term used in real research, and it began as a joke. In 1982, the cartoonist Gary Larson drew a panel for his newspaper strip The Far Side. In it, a caveman lecturer points to a diagram of a spiked dinosaur tail and explains to his class that the arrangement is called the thagomizer, so named, he says, after the late Thag Simmons. It was a punchline, nothing more. A made-up word honouring a made-up man who had presumably met the business end of one. But the word filled a gap. There had never been an official anatomical term for that particular structure, and paleontologists, who are not without humour, began using thagomizer among themselves, then in talks, then in print. It stuck. Today you will find it in museum labels and in scientific papers, a small permanent joke embedded in the language of a serious field. So the weapon at the end of the plated giant carries the name of a cartoon caveman, and every specialist who says it knows exactly where it came from, and says it anyway. There is something gentle in that, a reminder that the people who study these bones are people, and that the deep past can be studied with a smile. The thing itself is no joke at all. In Stegosaurus stenops, the best-known species, each of the 4 spikes measured roughly 2 to 3 feet long. Hold that in your mind against your own body. 2 to 3 feet is the distance from your shoulder to your fingertips, or nearly the length of your whole arm. 4 of those paired in 2 sets near the tip of a muscular tail, made of solid bone sheathed in horn, driven by the largest muscles in the animal. This was not decoration hanging off the back end. This was a set of 4 bone lances, and the tail that swung them was thick and long and low. For a long time that was all anyone could say with confidence. The spikes were there. They looked like weapons. It seemed reasonable to guess they were used as weapons. But paleontology is a science of evidence, and a reasonable guess is not the same as a proven fact. Plenty of features on plenty of animals look like one thing and turn out to serve another. The plates on the same animal are the perfect example. They look, to a casual eye, like armour, and for a century people assumed they were armour, and the careful study of the bone has now largely set that idea aside. A structure that appears to defend can turn out to display, or to signal, or to shed heat. Appearance is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. So the tail spikes needed more than their appearance. They needed a body on the other end of the swing. They needed a wound. And that is exactly what was found. In 2001, in a volume of studies devoted to the armoured dinosaurs, 3 researchers, Laurie McWhinney, Bruce Rothschild and Kenneth Carpenter, published an examination of injuries and disease in stegosaur spikes and in the animals around them. Rothschild in particular was a physician by training, a specialist in reading disease and trauma in ancient bone, in seeing where a skeleton had been hurt and had healed. And among the specimens they studied was something remarkable, not a Stegosaurus bone, a predator's bone, a tail vertebra from an Allosaurus, and set into that vertebra a wound. The wound was a puncture, a hole driven into the bone from outside through flesh, deep into the solid vertebra of the predator's tail, and when the researchers measured that puncture, when they looked at its shape and its size and the cross-section of the object that must have made it, they found a match. The hole matched the cross-section of a Stegosaurus tail spike. The width fit, the taper fit. The geometry of the injury was the geometry of the weapon, as if you could take one of those 2 to 3 foot bone lances and slot it back into the wound it had left, and find that it belonged there. Let yourself feel the scale of that puncture for a moment. Imagine the width of one of those spikes near its base, then imagine it punched into bone. A hole the width of a spike driven as deep as pressing your thumb to its own knuckle, straight into the tail of the largest hunter in the ecosystem. That is not a scratch. That is not a graze from brushing past a thorn bush. That is a deliberate powered strike that reached bone and stayed. But the depth of the wound is not even the most important part. The most important part is what the bone did next. Because the vertebra shows remodeling, it shows healing. Here is what that means, and why it matters so much. When living bone is injured, when it is punctured or cracked or infected, it responds. It is not inert mineral. It is a living tissue, laced with blood vessels, capable of dissolving damaged material and laying down new. Around the wound, the Allosaurus bone shows the signs of that response. New bone growing, the margins of the injury reworked. In the language of the study, a chronic condition, a long-lived infection and reaction rather than a clean fresh cut. And an infection that becomes chronic, that goes on, requires one thing above all others. It requires that the animal be alive to have it. The predator survived. The Allosaurus that was stabbed in the tail by a Stegosaurus spike did not die on the spot. It walked away. It lived on, days and weeks and quite possibly months and years, carrying the puncture and the slow infection inside its own tail, the bone reshaping itself around the memory of that single terrible strike. Every step it took afterward, it took with that wound. And because it lived, the wound had time to heal in a way we could read 150 million years later in a laboratory under careful eyes. Think about what that one bone tells you. It tells you the strike happened. Not in a painting, not in a guess, but in fact. A Stegosaurus swung its tail, and the spikes found a living Allosaurus and drove into it deeply enough to reach bone. It tells you the herbivore was not passive. It fought, and it fought effectively, and it hurt the most dangerous animal in its world. And it tells you the predator was tough enough to take a wound like that and survive it, which in turn tells you something about how routine and how dangerous these encounters must have been. The two animals shared the same ground, and sometimes they met, and the meetings left marks on both. Before we go further into how a tail becomes a weapon, let me say one honest thing, the way this documentary always tries to. This is one wound on one bone. It is powerful evidence that the tail spikes were used in defense, and it is widely accepted as exactly that. But a single injury does not tell you how often it happened, or how the animals moved, or what a whole fight looked like. The proof is real. The reconstruction we build around it is inference, careful and reasonable, but inference all the same. Hold both of those in mind at once. The strike is a fact. The scene is a story we assemble around the fact, and we should always know which is which. So how does a tail become a weapon? Look again at the animal. The tail of Stegosaurus is not the tail of the great sauropods, long and whip-like and tapering to a thread. It is shorter, thicker, more muscular, and it is held out behind the body low to the ground. And in recent decades, researchers have studied how that tail could move, modelling the joints between the tail bones, testing how far and how fast it could swing. What they find is a tail built for a wide, low horizontal arc, not a downward chop, not a lifted overhead blow, a sweep. The animal plants its heavy hind legs and the whole rear of the body pivots, and the tail comes around low and flat, out to the side, the spikes on the very end travelling the fastest because they are the farthest from the centre of the turn. The tip of a swinging arm moves faster than the shoulder, and the same is true here. The spikes, at the end of the longest lever, arrive with the most speed and the most force. Feel it in your own body, slowly, the way you might drift towards sleep. Imagine standing with your feet planted and swinging one arm out flat at hip height, sweeping it low across the space in front of you and around to the side. That flat level arc is the motion. Now imagine that at the end of your reach, where your hand would be, there are instead 4 spikes of solid bone, each as long as the arm itself, and behind the swing there are not the muscles of a human shoulder, but the massive muscles of a 2-ton animal. The tail sweeps low like your arm swung flat at hip height, and anything standing in that arc, at the height of a predator's legs, or hip, or tail, meets the spikes at the fastest point of the swing. That is why the wound was in the Allosaurus tail and why that detail rings so true. The height matches. A predator circling a Stegosaurus, working around its flank, keeping clear of the head and the front, would have its own hips and tail swing through exactly the zone the spikes command. The herbivore did not need to see well behind itself, or aim with precision. It needed only to sweep that low arc through the space a nearby attacker would occupy. The spikes did the rest. And notice what this does to the old picture of the animal. For a long time, the popular image of Stegosaurus was of a slow, dim, almost helpless thing. A walking meal shuffling through the ferns, its fate more or less sealed the moment a predator noticed it. The tiny head seemed to promise a tiny defense. but the wound in the Allosaurus vertebra tells a different story. This was an animal with an active, effective defensive behaviour, capable of turning its rear toward a threat and delivering a blow that could injure the largest hunter in its world and send it limping away. Defence here is not a passive shield worn on the back. It is a thing the animal does, a motion, a choice, a swing. This is worth pausing on, because it sharpens a distinction that runs through this whole account of the plated giant. Think of the two great structures on this body and what each one turns out to be for. The plates along the back, once imagined as armour, are now thought to have served mostly for display, for signalling, for recognition, with any shedding of heat a secondary effect. Passive. Something the animal was, more than something it did. The spikes on the tail run the other way. They are the true weapon, the active defence, the part of the body that reached out and struck. The armour that everyone assumed was armour turns out probably not to be, and the weapon turns out to be exactly a weapon, proven by a wound in a predator's bone. That reversal is one of the quiet pleasures of studying this animal. The obvious reading was wrong about the plates and right about the spikes, and only patient work with real fossils could tell you which was which. Now let yourself build the scene, gently, knowing it is inference laid over a single hard fact. The dry season on the Morrison floodplain, the light hot and high, the fern prairie yellowing, the animals drawn toward the shrinking green corridor along a river. A Stegosaurus, an adult feeding low, its beak rasping through horsetails, its plates catching the sun in a staggered row down its back, and at the edge of the stand, patient an Allosaurus, watching the way a predator watches, reading the herbivore for weakness, for youth, for a limp. The predator moves in, the herbivore knows. It does not run because running is not its gift. Instead, it turns. Not the head, the tail. It keeps its small head and its vulnerable neck angled away from the threat and brings the armoured spiked rear around to face the danger, pivoting on those heavy hind legs, the whole low body rotating. The Allosaurus circles, looking for an opening past the spikes, and the Stegosaurus turns with it, always presenting the thagomizer, always keeping the 4 bone lances between itself and the teeth. And then the predator commits, and the tail comes around. Low, flat, fast, the spikes at the end travelling in a wide arc through the space the Allosaurus has entered. And one of them finds the predator's tail, and drives in, deep enough to reach the bone of a vertebra, deep enough to leave a puncture the exact width of the spike that made it. The Allosaurus wheels away, hurt. The infection takes hold in the following days. The bone begins its slow work of walling off the damage, laying down new tissue, remodelling around the wound, and the predator lives and carries the injury until at last it dies of something else entirely, and its tailbone settle into the sediment of a river and wait. We cannot know if that exact sequence is how it went. We were not there, and one wound cannot narrate its own making. Perhaps the strike came differently, in a scramble, in a moment we would not recognise as a duel at all. What we know for certain is smaller and harder and more precious than any story. A Stegosaurus spike went into an Allosaurus deep, and the Allosaurus survived it, and the bone remembered. Everything else is us, leaning close to that fact, trying to see the animals move, and that single documented meeting, one predator and one prey preserved in the same act across 150 million years, tells you something true about the whole kind. The plated dinosaurs were not merely the strange, slow curiosities of old museum halls. They were animals with real defences, real behaviours, real force in their bodies, capable of holding their own against the fiercest hunters of the Jurassic. The tail was not a flourish. It was not, as some once thought, a passive echo of the plates. It was a working tool for staying alive, and it worked well enough to leave its mark on the enemy. That force, that active defence, was part of a body plan that proved remarkably durable across deep time. The plated giant of the Morrison was not the whole of the family, nor its end. The design that carried spikes at the tail and a small head at the front and a great arched back between them turned out to be a design that could travel, that could persist. that could show up in far corners of the ancient world in shapes both larger and smaller and stranger than the animal you have walked beside on these fern flats. The riddle of the plates may never be fully solved, and the exact choreography of that fight in the ferns will always be partly a thing we imagine. But the weapon is real, and the wound proves it, and the animal that swung it was only one member of a wider and older and more far-flung kind than Marsh ever guessed when he first pulled those strange bones from the Colorado rock. Late in the afternoon, the light goes long and low across the fern flat, and the animal moves into it without hurry. She's a grown Stegosaurus stenops, something over 20 feet from beak to tail spike, carrying perhaps 3,500 pounds on 4 unequal legs. The hind limbs are tall and heavily built, the front pair short and stocky, so her spine rises in a slow arch, with the hips lifted well above the shoulders. It gives her a strange downhill posture, the small head slung near the ground, body ramping up behind it toward the ridge of plates. She is built to browse low, and low is where she feeds. The ferns stand at about the height of your knee to your shoulder, a soft green sea broken by darker clumps of horsetail and the stiffer fans of cycads. She wades into it at a walking pace no faster than a slow amble, and the head comes down. There are no teeth at the front of her jaws. Instead, a horny beak, a sheath of the same stuff as a bird's bill, closes over the tips of the fronds and shears them off cleanly. The sound is a dry, repeating rasp, a sweep and a snip, a sweep and a snip as the beak drags through the growth and finds the next mouthful. Picture the feeling of it in your own hand. Draw your fingernails slowly across a length of coarse woven cloth, catching each raised thread, feeling the small resistance and release. That is the texture of her afternoon, translated to the edge of a beak the length of your forearm, moving through soft stems hour after hour. She takes only the tender parts, the young fronds, the fast-growing shoots, the low green things no thicker than half an inch. Her bite is not strong. Studies of her jaw mechanics suggest a weak, shearing force, enough to cut through a soft stem but not to crush hard wood. So she leaves the tough branches alone and keeps to the yielding stuff, cropping it and swallowing it with little chewing, letting the great vat of her gut do the slow work later. There is no rush in any of this. Her whole body seems tuned to patience. Bone studies of her kind suggest she grew slowly through life, and may have run a lower metabolic engine than many dinosaurs her size, a creature that took its time becoming large and takes its time staying alive. You can read that unhurried pace in the way she feeds now, one deliberate swing of the head after another, the barrel of her body swaying gently as she shifts her weight from one hind foot to the next. The plates along her back rock a little with each step, a double row of bony fins running from her neck to her tail. Those plates catch the low sun as she turns. Each is a slab of bone grown inside the skin rather than fixed to the skeleton, the tallest of them standing close to 2 feet high. Look at one edge on and you would see it is not a smooth blade but a surface, written over with grooves, shallow channels where blood vessels once ran close beneath the covering of skin. What that plumbing was for is one of the oldest arguments in the study of this animal, and it is worth being honest that no one has settled it. For a long time people thought the plates were armour, but that idea has mostly been set aside since the plates sit too high and too thin along the spine to guard the flanks where a predator would strike. The leaning guess now is that they were mostly for showing, a signboard of bone that let one Stegosaurus recognize another across the ferns, with any warming or cooling of the blood a secondary effect rather than the main purpose. Some have gone further and proposed that with all those vessels so near the surface, the plates might have flushed with colour when blood flow rose, a slow bloom of warmth spreading up the bone like heat rising into a face. That last part is speculation, a possibility floated by researchers and not a fact carried in the rock, and it should be held lightly. But it is a lovely thing to imagine as you watch her stand in the slanting light, the sun sliding along the ridge of her spine, each plate lighting up in turn as the angle finds it, the whole row briefly edged in gold before the head goes down again into the green. The plates alternate as they climb her back, staggered so that a plate on the left does not sit straight across from a plate on the right but a little ahead or behind it. Early workers assumed they came in neat pairs, but the best preserved skeletons show this offset zigzag arrangement instead, a detail that took decades of careful digging to pin down. From the side she is a wall of feeding animal topped by a broken crest of bone. From directly behind, the two rows lean apart, and you could look up the length of her back as if between the ranks of a slow procession. The world she feeds in is warm and dry and wide. This is a floodplain in the Late Jurassic, and the climate runs to long dry seasons broken by the flooding of seasonal rivers. There is no ice anywhere on the planet, no white caps at the poles, and the difference in warmth between the equator and the far north is gentler than the one you know. The air is hot and bright. The ground is a patchwork of dusty open flats and greener corridors that follow the water. Around her the soundscape is old and simple, with no birdsong in it at all, only the wind moving through the branches of primitive conifers, the papery rattle of fern fronds, and now and then a low percussion carried up through the soles of her feet, the footfalls of distant sauropods crossing the same plain. Those long-necked giants, the Diplodocus and the Camarasaurus and their kin, feed at heights she will never reach, stripping the conifer canopy far above her head while she keeps to the floor. It is a quiet division of the same country, each browser taking the layer that suits its build, and it means she can share this place with animals many times her weight, and rarely contest a mouthful with them. She lifts her head, chews, swallows, and moves a body length deeper into the fern flat, following the softest growth toward the darker green that marks the river. The margin of the water is mud, churned and open, and she comes to it carefully. Here the fern cover thins and the ground lies exposed. An open ground is where she's most watchful. She plants her 4 feet at the edge and lowers the small head to drink, the arched back rising behind her like a low hill over the brown water. Her reflection breaks and steadies. She takes the water in slow pulls, and between them she pauses, and in the pauses she is listening. Somewhere in this same country moves the great predator of the age, Allosaurus, the apex hunter of these floodplains, sharing her rivers and her fern flats. She has no way to know where it is now. She only carries the constant low pressure of its possibility. The reason a low browser lingers less at an open bank than in the cover of the ferns. The evidence that these two animals truly met is not a guess. One Allosaurus is known from a tailbone punched clean through by a spike, whose shape matches the weapon she carries at the end of her own tail, a wound that later healed, so the predator lived on with the memory of that strike buried in its bone. She drinks and lifts her head, and the water runs from the edges of her beak, and she does not stay long. Back in the ferns the light is failing now, going from gold to a deeper amber, and the heat of the day begins to lift off the plain. The far percussion of the sauropod herd has grown fainter, moving off toward its own night. The wind drops, the fronds go still. She crops her last few mouthfuls more slowly now, the rasp of the beak stretching out with longer silences between, until at last even that stops. She folds herself down toward the ground by degrees, the tall hind legs bending, the heavy body settling, the long tail with its 2 pairs of spikes coming to rest along the earth behind her. Each of those spikes runs 2 to 3 feet of solid bone, and even at rest they trail behind her like a set of laid-down blades, angled outward, pointed away from the body she must protect. The plates go dark as the last of the sun leaves them, the colour draining from gold to grey to the flat blue of dusk. Her breathing slows, the small head lowers, the great slow engine of her body idles down toward the cool of the night, and nothing in the scene is resolved, no danger met, no drama closed, only an old animal at ease in a warm and ancient world, resting where she fed. and that quiet weapon lying along the ground behind her, those 4 long spikes angled out into the dark, was not there for nothing. The tail, then, was no ornament, and the animal that carried it would spread its kind across the world and leave its bones for us to find. The tail, then, was no ornament, and the animal that carried it would spread its kind across the world and leave its bones for us to find. Picture the plated dinosaurs not as a single creature, but as a kind, a shape repeated and revised across tens of millions of years. The small low-slung head, the arched back rising toward the hips, the double row of bone running from the neck to the tail, and the long spikes at the very end. That design turned up again, and again, in rock laid down on land that would later drift apart into separate continents. Stegosaurus is only the most famous face of a much larger family, and once you learn to see that family, you begin to notice it scattered right across the ancient world. Start with Kentrosaurus, a smaller cousin from the Late Jurassic of what is now Tanzania, in East Africa. It measured only about 15 feet from beak to tail tip, far shorter than the giant of the American West. But it wore its armour differently. Along the front half of its body it carried narrow pointed plates, and toward the hips and tail those plates gave way to genuine spikes, a bristling arrangement quite unlike the broad staggered slabs of Stegosaurus. 2 members of the same family then, on 2 different pieces of the world, each answering the same evolutionary question in its own hand. One with wide flat plates that caught the light, one closer to a wall of spines, then travel north and forward in time, out of the Jurassic and into the early Cretaceous, to what is now Xinjiang in northwestern China. There you find Wuerhosaurus, a plated dinosaur that lived roughly 145 to 125 million years ago. That date matters more than it first appears. The great age of Stegosaurus, the Late Jurassic, had already closed. The sauropods it had walked beside were changing, and yet here in Asia the stegosaur lineage persisted. Wuerhosaurus is counted among the last of its kind, a straggler carrying an old design forward into a younger world. The plated shape did not vanish at the end of the Jurassic. In some quiet corner of the map it held on. Now across to Europe, to the Late Jurassic of Portugal, where the family produced one of its strangest members, Miragaia longicolum. Its name points to the oddity, for it carried an extraordinarily long neck for a plated dinosaur. Where most stegosaurs made do with a modest string of neck bones, Miragaia had at least 17 cervical vertebrae, a count that rivals some of the long-necked sauropods themselves. Imagine a plated body, spikes and all, but with the neck of a browser reaching upward and outward. It is the most complete stegosaur skeleton yet described from Europe, and it gave paleontologists their first real look at a European stegosaur skull. A plated dinosaur wearing in part the neck of a giraffe. The family, it turns out, was far more inventive than the single silhouette we carry in our heads. And Portugal offered one more gift, quieter but in its way just as important. For more than a century after Marsh first named Stegosaurus in 1877, the genus was known only from North America. Every good skeleton, every plate and spike and beaked skull came out of the American West. Then a fragmentary specimen surfaced in Portugal, in rock dated to the upper Kimmeridgian and lower Tithonian, the closing chapters of the Jurassic. Studied and published, it became the first solid evidence of the genus Stegosaurus outside North America. More than 130 years after the first bones came out of Colorado, the same animal, or something very close to it, was confirmed on the far side of what was then a narrowing sea. 2 shorelines of the young Atlantic sharing a plated giant between them. That is the wide frame, the family spread thin across continents and across the boundary between 2 periods. But if you want the single richest object the family has left us, you must come back across the ocean, to a museum in London, and stand before a skeleton the staff there calls Sophie. Her formal name is a string of letters and numbers, Eniamuk PV R3673 the kind of label that outlives every nickname. She's a Stegosaurus stenops, a young adult, and she is the most complete Stegosaurus ever found anywhere in the world. Let those words settle, because completeness is rare in this trade. Most dinosaurs reach us as fragments: a jaw here, a handful of vertebrae there, a single tooth, a broken limb, a plate snapped from a back we will never see whole. From those scraps, patient people build the animal by inference and comparison, filling the gaps with the shapes of relatives. Sophie asks far less of that filling. She's roughly 85 to 90% complete. Over 300 of her bones survived, and by some counts as many as 360. More than that, they were not crushed flat by the weight of the rock above them. They kept their 3 dimensions, their true curves and hollows and joint surfaces, the shape they held in life. Try to feel what 300 bones actually means when they are laid out for study. Not a tidy little tray. A floor. Imagine the pieces of her spread on a clean surface, skull and jaw, the long chain of the spine, the ribs curving away in pairs, the heavy limb bones, the plates in their graded sizes, the 4 tail spikes lying separate and dark. Stand at one edge with your arms open wide, and you could not reach across it. You would have to pace it out, arms spanning once and again, many times over before you crossed from the beak to the tip of the tail. A whole animal, taken apart, filling a room. That is the gift of Sophie. She's not a suggestion of a Stegosaurus. She is nearly the thing itself. She came out of the ground in 2003 at Red Canyon Ranch in Wyoming, found by a fossil hunter working that hard, dry country. From there she travelled eventually to the Natural History Museum in London, arriving late in 2013 and going on permanent display in December of 2014. Mounted for the public, standing on her own 4 legs, with her plates rising along her spine, she measures about 18 feet from end to end and stands roughly 9.5 feet tall at the highest plate. In life, the estimates put her weight near 3,500 pounds, about 1.5 metric tons, a mass often compared to a small rhinoceros. Young adult though she was, not yet at the full size the largest of her kind could reach, she was already a heavy, deliberate animal, the kind whose footfall you would feel before you heard it. Sophie is precious for a reason that goes beyond spectacle. Because so much of her survived, and survived uncrushed, she became a rare chance to test old questions against something close to a complete answer. How the plates truly sat along the back, how the limbs carried the body, how much the whole animal actually weighed. When you have most of a skeleton in 3 dimensions, you no longer have to guess the missing half. You can measure. And yet, and this is the quiet lesson at the heart of her, even Sophie does not close the case. Even the most complete Stegosaurus in the world leaves the deepest riddle standing. Bring your fingertip along her almost complete row of bones, and you can still feel the gaps, the few places where a piece is missing, small absences you notice precisely because everything around them is present. The nearly whole thing makes the holes easier to feel, not harder. Take her weight, since it seems the simplest of questions. Here is a young adult skeleton, more complete than any other, and still there is no single number that everyone agrees to write down as the truth. For this very kind of well-preserved individual, careful studies have produced masses ranging from roughly 1.5 metric tons to well over 2, and for the large members of the genus the figures climb higher still, toward 4,000 kilograms and beyond, something on the order of 8,000 pounds. The spread is not sloppiness, it comes from method. Estimate the mass one way, by reconstructing the volume of the living body and multiplying by a density, and you get one figure. Estimate it another way, by scaling from the circumference of the limb bones that had to carry the weight, and you get another. For similarly sized individuals, the published values can differ by as much as a factor of 2. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the most honest things paleontology can teach you. 2 careful people, working from the same bones, can arrive at answers that differ twofold, and both can be defensible. There is no scale in the Jurassic. No one ever weighed a living Stegosaurus. Every number we have is a reconstruction, a bridge thrown across 150 million years, and the honest report is not a single figure but a range with its uncertainty attached. The temptation is always to pick one clean number and speak it with confidence. The discipline is to say, instead, that the animal weighed somewhere in this band, and that we cannot yet be more precise, and that the not knowing is itself a fact worth stating plainly. A field grows up when it learns to admit the size of its own error bars. The uncertainty runs deeper than weight. It reaches all the way down to the animal's name. You might assume that a dinosaur this famous, this thoroughly studied, would at least have a settled identity. It does not entirely. Within the genus Stegosaurus, the species themselves are the subject of a long and unresolved argument. Two are broadly accepted. Stegosaurus stenops, the form with the best skulls, the species Sophie belongs to, described from a nearly complete skeleton found near Cannon City, Colorado, in 1886, and Stegosaurus ungulatus, a larger, longer-bodied species named by Marsh in 1879 from the Como Bluff beds of Wyoming, among the longest of all stegosaurs, with estimates reaching close to 30 feet. On those two, most specialists agree. The trouble sits with the original. The very first species Marsh named, back in 1877, was Stegosaurus armatus, and it is the one the whole genus is technically built upon. But it was named from fragmentary material, bones too poor and incomplete to pin down what truly separated this animal from its relatives. In 2010, the paleontologist Peter Galton argued that Stegosaurus armatus is a nomen dubium, a doubtful name, a type too fragmentary to diagnose. He proposed that the well-known Stegosaurus stenops, with its fine, complete skeletons, be made the official name-bearing type of the genus instead, so that the most famous dinosaur in its family would at last be anchored to bones we can actually read. That petition went to the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, the body that governs such names, filed as Case 3536. The plates and the spikes are dramatic, but some of the sharpest disputes in this field are fought quietly, over which fragment of bone gets to carry a name. There was a broader proposal too, floated in 2008, to merge several of these species and even related genera together into a tidier scheme, folding some of the sprawl back toward a single trunk. It was not widely adopted, and so the taxonomy stays tangled, a set of open questions rather than a closed list. How many species of Stegosaurus are genuinely valid? Whether close relatives like Hesperosaurus, that plated dinosaur from the older Late Jurassic of Wyoming and Montana, should really be considered an early species of Stegosaurus itself, as some authors have argued. Whether Wuerhosaurus, off in Cretaceous China, belongs inside the same genus or just beside it. These are not failures of the science. They are the science, working, in the open, on evidence that will always be partial. It is worth saying clearly what that means. When you hear a plated dinosaur named with easy confidence, remember that behind the name sits a working committee of careful minds who do not fully agree, and who would tell you so if you asked. The bones are old and broken and few. The living animals are gone. What remains is a conversation, patient and unhurried, carried forward across generations of scientists who will never meet the creature they describe. That conversation is the truest monument the family has, not the mounted skeleton under the museum lights, but the long, humble argument about what it was. And beyond the names, the real riddles wait, the ones the bones simply refuse to answer no matter how many we gather. You have walked through them across this journey, and here at the end it is worth drawing them together, laying them side by side like the plates along a back, to carry into the quiet. There is the oldest riddle of all, the plates themselves. 2 rows of tall bone, some reaching up around 2 feet high, arranged not in neat opposing pairs as everyone first assumed, but staggered, alternating down the spine, a fact only the best articulated skeletons revealed. They were made of bone set into the skin rather than fused to the frame, and their surfaces were carved with grooves for blood vessels. But what were they for? A century of argument has swung between answers. A radiator to shed or gather heat. A billboard for display, for recognizing your own kind, perhaps flushing with colour as blood coursed near the surface. A signal of male or female. The idea that they were armour, a shield against Allosaurus, has largely been set aside, for they were too thin and too oddly placed to guard the animal well. The current leaning favours display as the main purpose, with any warming or cooling a secondary effect. Leaning, not proof. After 100 years, the plates keep their secret. Close beside it lies the question of dimorphism. A 2015 study of a bone bed of the close relative Hesperosaurus, sometimes called Stegosaurus myosi in central Montana, found two distinct plate shapes among the buried animals, one kind wide and oval, with far greater surface area, one kind tall and narrow, and crucially, no intermediate shapes bridging the two, which is the pattern you might expect if the difference marked males from females. It is a tantalizing result. It is also contested, for those two shapes might instead reflect differences of age, or individual variation, or the line between separate species. We may be looking at the faces of male and female Stegosaurus, at last told apart. Or we may be reading a difference that means something else entirely. The bones hold two shapes and stay silent on their cause. Then there is posture and reach. Did Stegosaurus stay always low, a committed browser of ferns and horsetails and ground-level greenery, its beaked head sweeping through vegetation at knee-to-shoulder height? Or could it rear back onto its heavy hind legs, propping itself with that thick tail as a third support, to pull down foliage a story above the ground? Marsh himself changed his mind on such matters during his own lifetime, and the question has never been fully settled. The long, powerful hind limbs and the short forelimbs are real, and they permit either reading, the animal that could reach high, and the animal that never did leave much the same skeleton behind. And there is that strange cavity at the hips, the one Marsh once imagined held a second brain to run the back half of the body. That idea was set aside long ago. The enlarged space in the sacral region is now understood as an expansion of the spinal cord, likely housing a glycogen body or a large nerve ganglion, structures with echoes in some living birds and reptiles. It was never a thinking brain. But its exact job, glycogen store or nerve center or something else again, remains not fully pinned down. Even in correcting an old myth, the science lands on a smaller, humbler mystery, still unsolved, still waiting in the fused bone of the hips. Gather them now and hold them together, the purpose of the plates, the meaning of the two plate shapes, the reach of the neck and the truth of the posture, the work of that swelling in the spine. Each one is a place where we have gathered the bones, cleaned them, measured them, argued over them for a century and more, and still cannot say for certain what they meant to the living animal. This is not a failure to lament. It is the shape of honest knowledge about a creature that has been gone for 150 million years. We know so much. The seasonal floodplain it walked, the ferns it sheared with a weak-beaked bite, the giants and the great predator it lived beside, the healed wound that proved its tail a weapon. And still, at the centre, the plated giant keeps a core of quiet that no amount of study has yet dissolved. Perhaps that is fitting. Let the small absences remain, the gaps you feel with a fingertip along an almost complete row, the few missing pieces in even the finest skeleton the world has produced. They are not flaws in the record so much as invitations left open. Somewhere in the rock of Colorado or Wyoming or Utah, or in Portugal, or in some quarry not yet touched, another Stegosaurus lies waiting, its plates in their true positions, its skull intact, its bones uncrushed, holding perhaps the very detail that would tip one of these arguments toward rest. The next answer is already in the ground. It only waits to be found and then to be read, slowly and carefully, by someone patient enough to listen to it. For now, Let the great animal stand where it belongs, out on its warm, dry floodplain under a bright ancient sun, plates along its back catching the light, tail low and heavy behind it, the shadow of Allosaurus somewhere at the edge of the ferns. Let the camera of your mind draw slowly back from it, until the plated giant is one shape among many on a green and dusty plain, until the plain is one country on a drifting continent, until the whole warm Jurassic world turns quietly beneath a sky with no ice at its poles. The animal grows small in the distance and does not diminish. Its riddles ride out with it, unhurried, unanswered, patient as the stone that kept them. Consider for a moment that this plated giant was never alone in the world. It belonged to a family, a scattered clan of armoured browsers spread across continents and across tens of millions of years. Some were smaller than the animal you have been walking beside. Some were longer. A few clung on long after you might have expected the whole lineage to be gone. Their bones surface in Tanzania, in Portugal, in the deserts of western China, in the sagebrush of Wyoming and Montana. Each one is a variation on the same strange idea. A low body carrying a wall of bone along its spine. Begin in East Africa, in the late Jurassic rocks of the Morrison Formation, in what is now Tanzania. Here lived Kentrosaurus ethiopicus, a smaller cousin, roughly 15 feet from beak to tail tip. That is about the length of a modest fishing boat, a fraction of the bulk you would expect from its famous American relative. Kentrosaurus wore its armour differently. Along the front half of the body it carried narrow pointed paired plates, more like tall spades than the broad staggered slabs of Stegosaurus. Then, moving back toward the hips and the tail, those plates gave way to spikes. The animal graded slowly from ornament into weapon along its own length. Picture it low in the ferns under a hot Jurassic sun, a hedge of points running unbroken from shoulder to tail, small enough to vanish into the undergrowth, sharp enough that few predators would test it twice. That gradual shift, plate to spike, is part of why paleontologists treasure Kentrosaurus. It shows you that there was no single correct way to be a stegosaur. The family experimented. Some members leaned toward flat display surfaces, others leaned toward armament. Kentrosaurus sat somewhere in between, its body a slow sentence that began in plates and ended in spears. Now cross the ancient ocean west and north to the late Jurassic of Portugal, and meet one of the strangest members of the whole clan. Its name is Miragaia longicolum, and the second half of that name means, quite simply, long neck. This is where the family breaks the rules you thought it followed. Stegosaurs are supposed to be short-necked, low-slung, heads held close to the ferns. Miragaia carried at least 17 vertebrae in its neck. 17! That is a count you would expect from a sauropod, one of the towering long-necked giants, not from a plated browser barely taller than a person at the hip. Let that number settle against your own body. Run your attention slowly across the knuckles of one hand, counting each one in the other hand, then keep going past 10, past 12, past 15, until you have counted out 17 small joints one by one. That is how many bones stacked end to end held up the neck of Miragaia. Far more than a stegosaur has any business owning. The neck reached out ahead of the body like that long-counted row, patient and improbable, letting the animal sweep a wide arc of low vegetation without moving its heavy feet. Miragaia is precious for another reason. It is the most complete stegosaur skeleton ever described from Europe, and it preserves something the family rarely gives up, skull material, the first European stegosaur skull known to science. Stegosaur skulls are delicate, small, easily lost to time, so a real one is a quiet treasure. Miragaia sits inside a group called Decentrurinae, paired as the close sister of another stegosaur named Decentrurus. Together they form a distinct branch of the family tree, a European lineage that went its own way and grew that astonishing neck. When you imagine the plated giant, hold this cousin beside it, same armoured back, same low body, and then that unexpected neck reaching outward like a slow question the rest of the family never thought to ask. If you have been enjoying this slow walk through deep time, you can keep it close. Follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice, and the next long journey will find you on its own. Now travel forward in time, and this is where the family surprises you again. The great age of stegosaurs was the Jurassic, and the common understanding is that they thinned out and vanished as the Cretaceous opened. Yet in the early Cretaceous rocks of Xinjiang, in far western China, there lived a stegosaur called Wuerhosaurus homheni. Its bones date to somewhere between roughly 145 and 125 million years ago, well after the Jurassic had ended. This is one of the last of the line, a straggler holding on in Asia long after most of its kin had gone quiet in the rock. Wuerhosaurus tells you the family did not simply switch off at the Jurassic boundary. Somewhere in the Chinese interior, plated back still moved through the vegetation, while the rest of the world was changing around them. The armoured idea lingered tens of millions of years past its supposed prime, then returned home to the American West, to the same Morrison landscape you've come to know, and to a cousin that stands so close to the plated giant that scientists still argue about where one ends and the other begins. Its name is Hesperosaurus myosi. It lived in Wyoming and Montana around 156 million years ago, in the older part of the Late Jurassic, slightly before the classic Stegosaurus you have been following. Hesperosaurus is so similar that some researchers do not treat it as a separate genus at all. They fold it directly into Stegosaurus, calling it Stegosaurus myosi, one more species under the same banner. Others keep it apart. The disagreement is real and unresolved, a reminder that the branches of this family are drawn in pencil, not ink. Hesperosaurus matters for more than its name. A bone bed of this animal in central Montana, a graveyard where many individuals came to rest together, gave paleontologists a rare chance to compare plate after plate from what may be a single population. It was these plates that fed the long argument about whether male and female stegosaurs wore different armour, one form wide and rounded, another tall and narrow. That question remains open and debated. But it grew from these Montana bones, from a close cousin of the plated giant, and it shows you how much of the family's story is still being read from the ground. And within the plated giant's own genus, size itself was not fixed. The Stegosaurus you likely picture, the type known best from beautiful skulls, is Stegosaurus stenops, an animal roughly 21 to 23 feet long, weighing perhaps 1.5 tons in life, about the mass of a small rhinoceros. But there was a larger kind, Stegosaurus ungulatus, named by Marsh in 1877 from material at Como Bluff in Wyoming, reached toward 30 feet from beak to the tip of its spiked tail. 30 feet is the length of a long school bus laid nose to tail, or 4 tall people lying head to foot in a single line along the ground. Among all the stegosaurs the world has yielded, this larger species stands near the top for sheer length. It carried the same low head, the same double row of plates, the same 4 tail spikes, simply stretched across a longer frame, a bigger version of the same patient design moving through the same fern flats. So set them all in a row in your mind, this scattered family across time and space. Kentrosaurus, 15 feet of narrowing plates and rising spikes under the African sun. Miragaia in Portugal with its impossible counted neck and its rare, precious skull. Wuerhosaurus in the Chinese desert, a survivor lingering into the Cretaceous long after the others had gone still. Hesperosaurus in Montana and Wyoming, so close to the plated giant that the line between them blurs, and Stegosaurus ungulatus itself stretching toward 30 feet, the long end of the American lineage. Every one of them a different answer to the same puzzle, a low browser carrying a wall of bone into a world of ferns and conifers and hunting theropods. The plates differed, the spikes differed, the necks differed wildly in the case of Miragaia. The dates differed by tens of millions of years, from the height of the Jurassic to deep into the Cretaceous. What held them together was that armoured spine, that beaked and low-slung head. that refusal to grow tall or fast or fierce in the ordinary way. The family found 100 small variations and kept the core idea intact across continents that were themselves drifting slowly apart beneath their feet. And here is the quiet truth beneath the roll call. For all these names and numbers, for all the plates measured and the vertebrae counted, the deep questions still hang over every single member. Why the plates took the shapes they did, whether the differences marked males from females or simply one animal from the next. How the branches of the tree truly connect, which cousins belong together and which stand apart. The bones give you length and weight and age, hard figures pulled from stone. They do not give you the reasons. Each new skeleton, whether it surfaces in Tanzania or Portugal or the deserts of China, adds a fact and deepens a mystery in the same motion. The family grows larger and stranger the more of it you uncover, and the central puzzle only sharpens. And so, the riddle of the plated giant stays open, carried in stone across 150 million years, waiting quietly for the next question. And so, the riddle of the plated giant stays open, carried in stone across 150 million years, waiting quietly for the next question. You do not need to answer it tonight. Let it rest where it has always rested, in the bone, in the rock, in the long patience of the earth. Stay a moment longer beside Sophie, the most complete Stegosaurus ever found, some 300 bones lifted from Red Canyon Ranch in Wyoming, an animal about the weight of a small rhinoceros, roughly 18 feet from beak to spike. She lies at the center of everything you have walked through. Now, gently, begin to pull away. Rise slowly from her bones. Watch the low skull recede first, that small toothless head with its horny beak, the mouth built to sheer soft stems no thicker than your finger. Then the arched back lifts into view, hips higher than shoulders, and the two staggered rows of plates catch a Jurassic sun. They were never a wall of armour. They were bone set in skin, grooved for blood, up to 2 feet tall, and the light moves along them the way light moves along water. Perhaps they flushed with colour when the blood ran warm. Perhaps they only marked one giant apart from another. You are allowed to leave that undecided. Keep drifting upward. The whole animal grows small beneath you now, the 4 long spikes of the tail catching the last of the glare, the thagomizer that once punched a hole in an Allosaurus and left the wound to heal around the shape of the strike. From this height, the spikes are only a glint. The floodplain opens out around her, and you begin to see the world she lived inside. There are the fern prairies, green at knee height, running in soft corridors along the rivers. There are the scattered conifers and cycads and horsetails, the dry open ground between them pale with dust. Somewhere at the edge of hearing, a herd of sauropods moves through the taller canopy. Diplodocus and Apatosaurus and Camarasaurus and Brachiosaurus, each feeding at its own height so that none of them starves the others. Their footfalls come up through the ground as a slow percussion. There is no bird song in this air, only wind through primitive branches, the papery rattle of fronds, the distant rumble of great bodies, and always, somewhere, the quiet pressure of Allosaurus, the shape that made the tail into a weapon. Let all of it grow smaller. The rivers become bright threads across a semi-arid land, a warm world with no ice at its poles, its seasons swinging between long drought and the sudden green of flood. This was the Morrison, laid down across what is now Colorado and Wyoming and Utah, and Stegosaurus walked it near the end of the Jurassic, something like 155 to 150 million years ago. You're looking at a single afternoon inside a span so long the mind cannot hold it whole. That is all right. You do not have to hold it. You only have to watch it soften and go quiet. Before the scene fades entirely, let it carry you sideways for a breath. Out across the rest of the world these animals shared. There is Kentrosaurus on the Tendaguru plains of what is now Tanzania, smaller, its back running into paired spikes. There is Miragaia in Portugal, its neck stretched long with 17 vertebrae, strange among its kin. And far ahead in time there is Werhosaurus in China, one of the last of the whole-plated lineage, holding on into the early Cretaceous after the Jurassic itself was gone. A family scattered across continents and tens of millions of years, and every one of them still guarding secrets in the ground. This is the moment to let the questions rest, not solved, not abandoned. Simply set down for the night the way you set down anything heavy before sleep. We still do not fully know what the plates were for. We still argue, calmly, in journals, over whether two plate shapes mean male and female, or only mean two animals. We still cannot agree how many species truly stand, or whether Stegosaurus ever reared up on its hind legs to reach the higher leaves. We do not know its true weight to any certainty, since careful methods still disagree by nearly double. These are not failures. They are the open doors of a living science, and they will still be open in the morning, patient as the rock that keeps them. There is a comfort in that, if you let there be. The plated giant does not need you to finish it tonight. It has waited 150 million years already, and it will wait 150 million more. The unanswered parts are not a wound in the story of this animal. They are the reason people still kneel in the dust of Wyoming with soft brushes, the reason the bones keep being asked. What the fossil refuses to tell is simply the part that has not yet been reached. You can rest easily beside a mystery this old and this kind. So let the picture keep pulling back now, softer and slower. The continents themselves begin to shift beneath the drifting view, the Jurassic coastlines rearranging into shapes you would not know. The green goes grey with distance, the rivers thin to nothing. The great herds become a faint texture on a wide pale land, and then not even that. One small plated animal, somewhere down there in a fern prairie, lowers her beaked head to feed, and the whole of deep time settles over you as lightly as a thin blanket drawn up to the shoulders. Feel how little it weighs, all those millions of years. They do not press down. They only cover you, warm and quiet, one age folded over the next. The Jurassic sun already old, the bones already turning slowly to stone while she still breathes. You are held inside that long unbroken patience now. Nothing in it is in any hurry. Nothing in it asks anything of you. Let your attention loosen. The named creatures drift out of focus. Kentrosaurus, Miragaia, Werhosaurus, the great Allosaurus, gentle Sophie in her museum quiet, all of them softening into the same warm dark. The numbers loosen too, the 18 feet, the 2-foot plates, the 150 million years, until they are only a low murmur at the edge of thought. You do not need to keep them. They will keep themselves. That is what stone is for. The wind through the conifers grows fainter. The percussion of distant footfalls slows and thins. The light along the plates dims to a single ember, then to memory, then to nothing at all. And still the animal walks on, unbothered, through a world that will not need to survive for you to have loved it a little as you passed. Take one more slow breath, an easy, deep breath, and let the whole ancient afternoon go dark and calm around you. The riddle is safe. The bones are safe. The floodplain and its long dry seasons will still be there, held in the rock when you wake. There is nothing left to solve and nothing left to carry. The plated giant lowers her head one last time in the ferns, and the ferns close over her, and the quiet comes down like the last of the light. Let the deep time hold you now, weightless and wide, and let everything else fade away. You're exactly where you meant to be, at the far edge of an enormous stillness, warm beneath 150 million years. Rest here. The questions will keep, the stone will keep, and the plated giant walks on, patient and unhurried, into a dark that asks nothing of you at all. Sleep well tonight, traveller. Good night.